I live in Australia, and we don't have much woodlands here, besides a few that span on for a couple 100 acres or so. Nothing like what Americans have. And when I was younger, I would get lost in these woods a lot, and sometimes even sleep in them for a couple of days at most, surviving off fish and creek water. I never had any creepy encounters besides this one time. I was about 10 years old, and just like I do at least every 2 to 3 years, I had gotten lost in the woods again. I was completely fine during the day, as I had eaten an hour prior to realizing I had no idea where I was. I decided to walk around to find some sticks to make a little fire. I knew a lot about outdoor survival, as my family went camping a lot, and I watched videos on YouTube all the time since it interested me, and I loved the woods. I had set up a fire as it started getting dark, and was about to put out my fire before I saw a small deer on the tree line just nearly out of range of my fire's light. It was staring at me, which gave me some chills, but I just went, "Aw, a little deer," and I waved to it. The deer scurried off into the bush behind it, and I couldn't see it anymore. Then I heard this really weird noise, like twigs snapping, and all of a sudden, a much larger deer came out of the same bush that I had just seen the smaller one jump into. At this point, I knew something was off, so I stood up and stared at the deer, and it stared back at me. I was mentally preparing myself for the idea that this thing could run at me. The deer started walking a bit towards me, and then I backed up a little and crouched down. But as the deer kept getting closer, and I kept backing up, I looked down and realized this thing had a hoof directly in the fire, and it wasn't reacting to it at all. This creeped me out. I mean, its fur was burning, and it was starting to burn its skin, but it just wasn't reacting. I immediately set off bolting, but I heard it coming behind me, not really running, but fast enough to keep up with my little legs. I came over this small hill and jumped down into a bush to try to hide, and that's when it happened. The scariest thing I've ever seen in my entire life, and I remember it so vividly. The deer's silhouette against the moonlight appeared, and as I stared at the deer, it let out this blood-curdling call that I've never heard from another animal before, and all of a sudden, the silhouette started caving in on itself. I could hear the bone snapping and the flesh ripping, and this thing just kept getting smaller. Then suddenly, it got much bigger, and I closed my eyes because I couldn't watch anymore. When I opened them, there was a man standing where the deer stood, or at least, the silhouette of a man. He was looking around, and then he started calling out in this creepy, almost distorted voice.
"Hello? Hello?"
And he repeated this for about 10 minutes, while I just sat there in silence, refusing to answer. He stood just a couple meters above me. The man then just walked off into the trees, and I heard that same awful snapping noise before it eventually faded away. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in that bush the rest of the night, terrified that this thing could still be lurking around the area, waiting for me to appear again. Once the morning came, I walked a straight line until I reached a road I recognized, and then I ran home. I didn't tell my family about it, as I feared I wouldn't be taken seriously, but I was terrified. I haven't been to the woods since that day, and always stayed home when my family went camping after, begging them not to go. I'm a preschool teacher, and I have 2 co-teachers with me in the same room. Each of our kids has their own hook to hang their backpacks on, labeled with their name. One day, I was taking pictures of each kid doing a specific task, which happened to be next to the backpack hooks. We have to be careful not to have any identifying things in the background, like other children's faces, certain names, that kind of thing, because we send the pictures to their families. I took a picture of a student, let's call him Caleb. I was looking in the background and I noticed that his name on the hook was in the picture, which I thought was a pretty cute coincidence. Now Caleb's hook is next to another student. Let's call her Steph. The next week, I'm looking at the hooks, and I say to my co-teacher, "Hey, did you switch Caleb and Steph's names on the wall?" She said no, and then looked. Their names switched places, because we know for a fact Caleb's hook was on the end, and now it wasn't. So we thought it was probably the other teacher or something. We asked the other teacher. Nope. Then I remembered. I took the pictures next to those hooks. I'll easily look at them to see their order. I looked on our iPad's picture album, and they weren't there. None of the photos I took of anyone were there. The ones before and after were still on the iPad, but not my specific ones. I checked the recently deleted, and nope. So I went to Caleb's profile online, where we send in the photos. His picture was there, with the background cropped, but it wasn't the picture I took of him. He had a different hairstyle and clothes that he's never worn before. The picture looked like a mix between outdated and futuristic. I showed it to the co-teachers, and they were just as confused and weirded out as I was. We still have no idea what happened. Last weekend, my 5-year-old and I went tent camping in the Uintas northeast of Utah. The weather was overcast weather. By the time we got done paddleboarding, we made our way back to camp. Once we got back to camp, I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. I mostly shrugged it off, thinking I'm overthinking the safety of my child. One thing to point out, there was a trailer and a truck close to us, but I never saw anyone throughout our experience from there. At around 8 p.m., we started our campfire. We roasted brats and ate snacks. During this time, I would think I heard a crack or a subtle movement, and thought it was just the embers popping. Once the sun finally set, I noticed it was completely pitch black outside the reach of our campfire, most likely due to the overcast weather. At this point, I decided it's time to pack up our food and take it to the car. But I had this sudden feeling that I was being watched, and I decided to turn my headlamp light on. I faced 30 degrees to the right in front of me. About 10 to 50 feet from us, I see a small bush-like tree. I want to explain. This small bush-like tree was not thick or sturdy enough for something big to lean on or climb onto. And above the tree, standing behind it, I see 2 big circle white eyes with a hint of purple staring straight at me. The animal creature was far enough from the glow of the fire that I couldn't see the silhouette of a body, but it was close enough that it was odd behavior, and it was only seconds from us if it ran towards us. My first thought was that it was a bear standing on its hind legs, just being curious. It looked to be 8 feet tall or so. As I had my light facing the creature, who was abnormally close to our campsite, I grabbed my kiddo and bear spray and told my kid that there's a bear behind the tree, and assured him that we would be fine. This creature just watched us intently. Suddenly, a few seconds later, my intuition screamed, "Get out, now!" I then started walking backwards towards my car and told my kid to walk slowly with me. The creature made no movement and tilted its eyes on us as we moved away until my light could no longer reach it. I can't explain this new type of fear I was experiencing. It was unnatural. I think prioritizing my boy's safety allowed us to get to the car in a much more composed manner. Once in the car, we waited 30 minutes to see if it would come to the campsite to look for food, but nothing happened. I thought perhaps it left and we could sleep in the car to be safe. I decided that I'm going to try and grab blankets from the tent, put out the fire, and we can pack out first thing in the morning. I thought wrong. The campsite from the car was about 150 feet away. To the right of us were big trees, and to the left of us is tall grass and brush. I get out of the door and turn my headlamp on. My light shines towards the brush, and laying low in the brush, I see the white eyes again staring up at me. I decided to try and act big and yell out at the creature, but it made a move towards me, which in return made me jump back into the car and reverse. I tried to shine my car lights towards it and couldn't see anything. I decided to find help. I drive down and find a friendly fellow dad camper who is happy to help me pack up my things to leave. He arrives with a much brighter flashlight and his truck. As I am packing, he sees the eyes and mentions there's 2 of them. He states they're not moose, deer, cougars, and if it's a bear, it's really odd behavior, and he doesn't know exactly what they are. I face towards where he is shining the light, and I see a second pair of white eyes. At this point, I am terrified. One of them is standing tall, while the other is lower. This time, they are much further back, as if they now know there's a new reach limit to the light devices being used. It wasn't until the lower set of eyes decides to stand up and be much taller than the first one, looking monstrous. This made my new friend very uneasy, and he quotes, "This has got me on edge. Let's just throw everything in your car and leave." The whole time, while we were packing out, I would catch these creatures making a perimeter around us. They just walked around the campground in circles, waiting for something, it seemed. When I was a kid in Mexico, we loved to play hide and seek with all of the kids in the neighborhood at night. The houses were so close together that you could jump from roof to roof. And with everyone being friendly and knowing each other, they wouldn't mind if we did get on the roof. We had my cousins come over for dinner, and our parents were just out on the porch having a couple of drinks. Some of the kids came over and asked if we wanted to play. It was already dark out, and this is when we especially like to play, so we agreed. There was this one girl I had a thing for, who also happened to join that night. I knew if I could get her alone, I might have a chance to kiss her. I knew she liked me too, so it would all work out. We all gathered in the middle of the street, and randomly chose who would count. Then all the other kids would run and hide. So as the kids started counting, I looked at the girl, waving at her to come follow me. Holding my hand, I led her to my aunt's house, which was vacant at the time. She was on vacation, and I knew the house was empty, and I didn't see any other kids go in there. The front door was locked, so we ran to the back and checked if it was locked too, and it was. But at the back of my house, my aunt had an old washing machine, and I knew we could get in from her roof. I helped her up first, and when she got up, we could hear someone coming, so I told her to go and hide, and she ran off. I was able to make it on the roof not long after, and I knew for sure someone was searching the house next to my aunt's. My aunt was having the second story redone, so I hid in a half-completed bathroom. I thought I was alone, but I felt someone grab my hand. It was pitch black in there, and I couldn't see who it was, but I heard a soft voice whisper,
"It's just me. Don't worry."
It was most definitely her, so she squeezed my hand a little more. We hid for some time, and it was great, Then, from afar, we could hear all the kids saying that they gave up. We had won the round. I came out of the bathroom and looked down the street where all the other kids were. That's when I saw her, clear as day, looking at me. I froze. If she was down there, whose hand am I holding? Slowly turning my head, I can still feel the grip of whoever's hand I was holding. With it still being dark, I managed to see the glow of two eyes looking straight at me, without a face. I wasn't the only one to see it. When I got down from the roof and jumped down to where all the kids were, they were all pointing up and behind me, asking who it was. They could see the red eyes too. We stopped playing immediately and went back inside one of the other kids' houses. When I was in my early 20s, I used to jog through a massive cemetery called Hillside, just outside Philly, when I came home from Temple U to visit my mom. I loved jogging through there because it was so quiet and peaceful, aside from the sounds of nature. One very late afternoon, dusk, I was jogging through the main part of the cemetery and started to move along a small service road deeper into the cemetery, about a half-mile long, that connects to another cemetery in an adjacent town, called Ardsley Cemetery. There are roughly 100 yards of uncut grass and weeds on both sides of the little road that leads to a dense forest, with one side, on the left, leading to a fenced-off railroad track surrounded by trees that run through the area. As I approached midpoint, I noticed a teenish girl sitting on a massive dead log, stripped of bark, to the left that must have been dragged out somehow close to the road after falling in the woods. She was distinctively wearing 70s clothes, a retro fad in the early 90s, with massive bell-bottoms, scruffy white blouse, greasy sandy blonde hair, parted in the middle, and leather sandals. She did not face me as I approached, and just kept her head facing the dark woods across the other side of the road. But I know she must have heard me hitting the pavement as I approached. So now, we were the only people in this old little service road, with no one in front or behind as I passed between the two cemeteries. As I approached her and crossed her line of sight, she quickly shifted her eyes toward me as I said hi. I was shocked by the weirdness of her face, with larger than normal eyes, a tiny nose, thin small mouth, and the whiteness of her skin. And her eyes, they were white-blue, like a Siberian husky's, with massive dark rings around the irises. She said nothing back and just stared at me, expressionless, as I stumbled past. I say stumbled because I immediately felt this force hit my perception when we locked eyes, which made everything super detailed and surreal. I could no longer hear the sound of my own shoes hitting the pavement anymore for those endless seconds. Deafness. No sounds, not even crickets. And time seemed to slow down, as if I was jogging in slow motion. Disoriented as I was, I continued along the road, past her, toward the other cemetery for about 5 to 7 seconds, and my curiosity got the better of me. I turned around to jog back, but she was completely gone. Nothing there but this huge dead log. I checked all around it. Nothing. Now I know the area quite well, and there is absolutely no way that she could have left my line of sight unless she sprinted 100 yards into the woods in less than 7 seconds. Impossible, especially in her clothes. I scanned the tree lines and nothing. Just darkening woods as the sun fell below the tree line, but a feeling that I was being watched. Again, no sound of crickets. Hairs on my neck and arms standing on end, despite heavy sweating from the run. I think I did a 7-minute mile out of there all the way home before the sun completely dropped. It gives me chills every time to think about that face and those piercing eyes. Suffice to say, I've never felt the urge to jog through there again. I live alone. I fell asleep on the sofa with my phone next to me. I woke up a couple of hours later and I couldn't find my phone. I finally used Find My Phone to get it to ring. I could hear it upstairs. It's in my bedroom somewhere. It was coming from my bed, by the pillows. I lift the pillows and duvet, not there. It's actually inside the duvet at the top. Am I really to believe that I sleepwalked to my bedroom, undid the duvet cover at the bottom, pushed my phone all the way up to the top, and then did the duvet cover buttons, and made my bed look neat, and then went back to the sofa downstairs? This happened when I was 15, in late 2009. I grew up in rural Denmark, and believe me, I have seen some bizarre things in the 20 years I lived there until I moved to Copenhagen. It was shortly after sunset in November when my friend Ina texted me saying I should come up to her place, which was not far from where I lived. It was already dark when I went up there, and I didn't think too much of it then, even though it was already kind of unsettling, particularly when I crossed by a certain little mount close to where she lived. She stood in front of the building she lived in, and at first she got me up to her room. She seemed rather off, and she immediately told me what bothered her once she closed the door. She told me that in recent days, whenever it had become dark, she had noticed a tall, slender man stand underneath a streetlight down the street, and that he was a creepy weirdo. At first, I didn't think much of it, thinking she was exaggerating because she was venting out her frustrations about something in school. When we went outside and we walked a few meters down the street, we stopped, and that's where we saw him. Several meters away, he stood there, under a streetlight, leaning onto it. He was tall, slender, and he seemed to kind of glitter or sparkle under the lamp. I could not really see his face, except that I could see a wide grin even from afar. He didn't move, except once among the times that my friend yelled slurs at him, and no, I don't think my friend should have done this. He just didn't move, and when he once did move, he turned his head in our direction. There was something off about it. It's hard to describe. We also never went further down to him. It was like there was a boundary that prevented us from doing so, not to mention that I didn't want to be closer. But speaking of my friend yelling in his direction, that's where I noticed that the entire neighborhood was silent. Not just silent, but it seemed like the lights in each of the houses and buildings were off. It was actually as if life itself was switched off, and I otherwise heard nothing. No birds, no dogs, no cats, nothing. It was just plain silence. I asked my friend to stop, and we went back to her place. After an hour or so, I went home, and boy, did I not look forward to the walk down to my place after that encounter. As I walked down to the street, I made sure not to look in the direction where this man stood. As I went down the hill, something told me not to look back and to only go straight forward. And then I noticed the silence again. There's a highway on the other side of the already harvested cornfield, and there was no traffic there and no sounds. This silence was truly unsettling. And this is one of the first times I experienced the so-called Oz factor, which I didn't know the name of until last year. This manipulated reality stopped the moment I opened my door to my home and my dog greeted me. The next day, when my parents were out working, Ina called me and said she wanted to come to my home, saying she had nightmares the previous night and that she felt that this man was after her, even if she couldn't see him. Ina arrived very scared at my house, and a few minutes after her arrival, my dog began barking hysterically outside, and I had never heard him growl or bark this hysterically. We went outside to the garden, and Ina said, "It's him! It's him!" But we only saw my dog barking in the air in the middle of the grass around the swing. Despite the fact that we didn't see anyone, I could feel the presence of someone, and I'm sure it was the man from the previous night. We went inside, took my dog in too, and we went to my room, where my friend laid on my bed, having a bizarre seizure and basically entering a strange vegetative state, and didn't respond to me. This lasted several minutes. It almost felt like I was doing some kind of exorcism, as I constantly cried out to God for help, even though I had no idea what was happening and what I was doing exactly. And in case anybody wonders why I didn't call an ambulance, keep in mind I was 15. I didn't want any trouble, and no one would have believed any of the stuff I have told that had happened before the seizure. Suddenly, she woke up from that state, and she simply said that she had passed out. Nothing happened over the next hour, though everything felt really weird. We never spoke of the encounter afterwards. It was only a year later that I learned of the grinning man, how he had been seen around Point Pleasant during the time the Mothman haunted the place in the 60s, and how terrified people have been of that grin. I should mention here that he is often lumped together with the entity of Indrid Cold. But apart from grinning and probably being from space, these two entities don't have anything in common, as Indrid Cold was able to properly communicate with humans and had an interest in humanity. Around the time I learned of who the grinning man was, another friend told me that her brother and his friends had an encounter with him in the forest in daylight. It was the previous year, and maybe even during the same time when I had my encounter. They had a walk in the forest, and then they saw someone from the side. Under the shadows, they saw this tall, slender figure, kind of greenish, staring at them with wide eyes and a wide, fixed grin. They all ran away in terror from what they saw. I love how despite that this entity has been seen by many around the world, still essentially nothing is known about him whatsoever. I do hope that I never have a similar encounter again, yet I would personally love to hear other people's encounters with him. My mother grew up in the Mexican countryside on a ranch where houses were scattered far apart, and nighttime brought pitch-black darkness due to the absence of streetlights. One day, she was walking to a party with her brother and sister in the early afternoon when it wasn't dark yet. As they made their way through the remote area, my mom happened to glance up at the sky and noticed a mysterious light moving about. She kept the sighting to herself, knowing all too well that it was rumored to be a witch, a common belief in many parts of Mexico. They get to the party and enjoyed it, momentarily forgetting about the odd sight. However, when the party ended around midnight, they began their journey back home through the now pitch-black countryside. Halfway there, the inexplicable light appeared in the sky once more, and this time, her siblings also saw it. They continued walking in silence, not daring to mention the eerie sight to one another. Then, out of the blue, my mom tripped and turned to look behind her, catching a fleeting glimpse of a mysterious lady. Almost instantaneously, the figure transformed into a glowing light and ascended into the sky, all of this happening in a matter of seconds. Back in junior year of high school, when I was 16, my family and I were moving to a new apartment. Near the end of the day, me, my dad, and my family friend were walking from the apartment to the elevator so we could go to the car and grab the last of the things. When my dad stepped into the elevator, the door closed almost immediately. It was specifically weird because the door had only been open for a couple of seconds, and it closed way faster than I've seen an elevator close before or after. The door won't open, so we're all confused. We're talking to my dad. He can hear us. We can hear him. Then suddenly, mid-sentence, his voice just cuts off entirely, and the doors open, and the elevator is just empty. So me and the family friend just sort of stare for a second. I step in and look around. No sign of Dad. I step back out of the elevator, and immediately the doors close again, and then reopen, and my dad is just standing in the middle of the elevator looking dumbfounded. So we ask him what happened. He explains, from his perspective, that after the elevator door closed, at one point, he stopped hearing us, and the elevator went up. Then it just stopped, and he heard what seemed to be wild animals he couldn't quite identify, and the sound of scratching on the door. This felt like it lasted 5 minutes to him, before suddenly the elevator door opened, without the elevator ever feeling like it went back down. We lived there for over a year. We never did figure out what happened, and the elevator never did that again. It was late, around 12 to 2 a.m., sometime around then. I was dropping off my girlfriend at the time back to her house. It was raining kind of hard, but then stopped by the time I reached my house, after I dropped her off. There's this Korean church across the road near my house, which is dimly lit. I'm looking at the church to get my keys to unlock the door, and there's a person at least 6 feet tall, staring at me from the church in the dimly lit area, which I should add, the light was illuminating this cross that was underneath the light. Anything underneath this light you can see 100%. It was only dim for me because I'm at least 100 feet away, and it was a very orangish old light. In many rural areas of the American West, cutting firewood in national forests is a necessary chore if you want a warm house through the winter. Our home in mountainous central Idaho was no exception. It was normal for my dad to pick me and my brothers up after school and head into the mountains for an afternoon of firewood gathering. My dad would fell the trees, then saw them into chunks. My brothers and I had the task of rolling the wood to the truck and loading it. We would continue this assembly line process until we had a truckload of wood, usually before nightfall. Hot, sweaty, and exhausted, we would pile into the truck cab and make our way down the mountain. At home, the next day, we would unload and split the wood and stack it into neat little rows. This process was repeated until we had a winter's worth of fuel for our house, our grandma's cabin, and any extra for elderly neighbors. This particular afternoon, we decided to try a different logging road on the other side of the valley. No real reason for the change, but my dad said he wanted a change of scenery. This logging road hadn't been maintained in some time. Large rocks and fallen branches littered the path. My brothers and I had to walk out in front, pushing rocks and wood out of the way, as my dad lurched the truck up the switchbacks. Yard by yard, we slowly made our way up the mountain. That hike was physically brutal. As we ascended the mountain and got farther into the trees, this odd feeling started to set in. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion from the hike or something more. There was an electricity in the air, like the whole mountain was buzzing at a wavelength just below my senses. In some odd way, I felt like the mountain knew we were there, and it wasn't welcomed to the fact. I wanted to say something to my brothers, but before I opened my mouth, my younger brother said, "Does anyone else feel like we're not welcome here?" My older brother and I stopped in our tracks and looked back at him. Both of us nodded in agreement. This moment was broken by my dad honking and motioning us to continue to clear the path. Reluctantly, we pushed forward to a small clearing in the woods where we finally stopped the truck. My dad, oblivious to our apprehension, or simply choosing to ignore it, grabbed his saw and went to work. As the wood was felled and loaded, I couldn't shake this ominous feeling enveloping me like a dark shroud. I noticed my brothers were taking occasional glances over their shoulders as we worked. Everyone, but my dad, it seemed, was on edge. The sun nestled down into the trees and twilight began to set in. As the light drained from the sky, my anxiety only intensified. It wasn't until my dad unexpectedly told us to load up that a wave of relief flooded over me. I could see the tension in my brothers melt away as well. The truck wasn't fully loaded, an oddity. Getting half a load was a waste, according to my dad. We would sometimes work into the dark just to make sure that the truck was full, but tonight, he seemed eager to head home. With everything loaded, we started down the road, and although dead tired, everyone seemed to be in a much lighter mood. We were chatting and cracking jokes while trying to blow off steam from the afternoon. We were almost out of the tree line and into the valley desert. Going down the switchbacks, you want to be careful, especially with a load, even if it was half that. A brown blur jumped up from the downslope side of the switchback. "Shit!" was the only word that came out of my dad's mouth as he slammed on the brakes. Loaded with wood and traveling downhill, there was no way to avoid smashing into the blur. The truck finally ground to a standstill. The four of us peered through the windshield, nobody saying a word. Illuminated in the yellow glow of our headlights was a crumpled body of a deer. Grumbling and cursing the deer's existence, my dad exited the truck to investigate. Doing as they were told, my brother stayed put in the truck. I didn't listen, following close behind my dad. The truck was fine. We hadn't been traveling fast when we smacked the deer. Just some hair and blood in the grill guard. Hitting a deer really wasn't that unusual. The mountains were full of them. But what was unusual was the fact that the deer dropped so quickly. At faster speeds, deer could still be upright and sprinting away to die in the woods after a collision. That last burst of an adrenaline dump. This one fell over like a rag doll. Before even approaching the carcass, a deep, foul smell hit us. Deer smell bad when they're alive, but this was on a whole other level. It was the smell of decay and rot. My stomach began to turn as we got closer. My nostrils were burning. Coming up on the deer, it was clearly dead. Really, really dead. The stench was so overwhelming, my eyes were watering. The body was a true horror scene. The deer's eyes were gone, replaced with sunken, hollow holes. As if to overcompensate for their absence, the tongue was swollen and black as coal. It could not be contained and hung out the side of its mouth. The underbelly was split open. Entrails and offal spilled into the dirt. In the dim headlights, it looked as though the deer's fur and viscera were moving, wiggling almost. Holding my breath, I bent down for a closer look, and my heart stopped. The deer, inside and out, was covered in maggots. It was dead all right, but our truck didn't kill it. Clearly, it had been dead for days, if not weeks. I backed away retching, and that electric anxiety came screaming back. My dad has always been the quiet, stoic type, but right now, Even in the dim headlights of the truck, I could see the abject horror in his face. His gaze wasn't on the deer, but focused down the mountain. Poorly masking the fear in his voice, he told me firmly to walk back to the truck and get inside. I obeyed without objection. As I grabbed the door handle, a loud shriek came out of the trees. Branches were shattering and breaking. Something was heading up the slope towards us. I slammed my door closed just as my dad reached the truck. Before his door was shut, he pressed on the accelerator. The truck launched forward, sending us over the deer carcass and racing downhill. With mine and my brothers yelling, it was hard to tell if the shrieking was following us. Our truck popped out of the tree line and into the desert sagebrush. Once out of the woods, everything quieted down. We were left with only the rumble of the engine and wind through the half-opened windows. Pulling into our property, the truck came to a stop. We sat in silence. No one moved to leave the truck. Everyone started talking at once. We all had questions. What was that screaming? How does a dead deer jump uphill in front of a truck? There was no way the truck killed it. Dad just shook his head and motioned for us to quiet down. That deer was dead when we hit it. It didn't jump out in front of us. It was thrown at us. We stared at him. He explained that all day up in the mountains he had felt uneasy. Not wanting to worry us boys, he kept it to himself. He described it like walking into a stranger's living room while they were all upstairs asleep. That feeling never left him, and as twilight came, he happened to catch a shadow in the corner of his eye. Not far into the woods, he saw figures moving from tree to tree. He couldn't focus on them long enough for a good look before they dodged behind trees. His stomach dropped. Working hard to keep his composure, he hurried us to the truck to leave. It was after hitting the deer and discovering it was long dead that my dad pieced together what was happening. Something threw that deer to get us to stop. Before the shrieking began, he could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the road. It was a trap. Running back to the truck could have started an ambush or triggered a prey drive, so we walked back to the truck. The second we were inside, he drove that truck downhill with no intention of stopping for anyone or anything. The feeling of electricity didn't disappear until we hit the county highway. My brothers and I never saw anything as we drove away, but those screams in the forest will never leave my mind. We didn't gather firewood the rest of the season. For the first time in his life, my dad just bought what we needed. And although we started to gather wood again the next season, we've never been up to that particular mountain. The Forest Service has permanently closed and reclaimed that road. The only way back up into those woods is a long hike, one I'm not interested in ever taking again. This happened to me a few years ago. I live near a lake, more of a pond, really. Right up the road is a small hill that leads to a hiking trail. I know this trail like the back of my hand, and one night I decided to go on a hike. It just got done snowing, and there was a full moon, and like that Disney princess, the cold never really bothered me anyway, but it was a little slippery going up the hill. The trail was a little buried under the snow, but it's a full circle, and it's impossible to get lost. I get going, and I finally made it to the part of the trail where it's covered in trees. But being wintertime, it more resembles bony hands reaching towards the heavens. This is when I saw it. I saw a silver light shining in the distance. The way it moved, I assumed it was some trash caught in a tree, but the closer I got, the more it seemed to take shape. I was about 500 to 600 feet away when I saw that it was a woman. She was in a silver dress, a real fancy-looking one. It's definitely not something anyone would wear in this weather. As I got closer, I could see that she looked like she was crying. I assumed she was lost or in some type of danger. I began to walk closer to her, and as I did, she began to walk towards the lake. It's a pretty steep drop-off to the lake from where she was. I began to run after her to see if I could help, but by the time I reached where she would have been, there was nothing and no one around. I look all around and even climbed down to where she would have fallen, but nothing, not even prints in the snow except for mine. By the time it dawned on me, there was no trace of her even being there. I heard a scream like nothing I ever heard before, and I look up to see the woman just walking on the water. It may have snowed, but it definitely was not cold enough for the lake to freeze. I stood there, frozen in fear, as it dawned on me of what I was seeing. She let out one more scream before sinking under the lake. I hightailed it back to the trail and back to my home in record time. I'm not even sure what I've just seen was real. I've never gone back at night hiking, and even now, I never go alone in the day. I met this very awesome guy near Christmas time 2013 in Oakland, California, while fleeing a bad situation in Arizona. We were immediately in our own world, falling in love fast, when the reality of his divorce and process and some of my own circumstances started to interfere. Our whirlwind lasted a glorious 3 months, but our connection had been incredible and instant. When I stopped seeing him, he started drinking very heavily and got sick. We were both bummed it didn't work out, but said goodbye on very good terms. When I returned to Arizona in 2014 and was busing to work at night, I saw him, the night of a gorgeous full moon in December, no less. I was walking from the bus stop to work when I saw someone standing in the corner up ahead, looking down at a cell phone. This alone was odd, because I never saw anyone on this stretch at this time of night. The closer I got, the more I realized it was the guy from Oakland. I couldn't understand why he would be in Arizona, or how he found exactly where I was at this moment. My stride quickened as I was excited to approach and maybe talk to this person. But when I got about 50 yards away and could see that it was definitely him, aside from this strange softness to the skin on the face he didn't normally have, the haircut, sideburns, his height, build, shoes, and clothes were incredibly uncanny. He looked up from his phone directly at me and then took off at a full run up the adjacent street. I hurried to the corner, looked down the street that he had run up, and saw absolutely no one. This was a Friday night. I would work the weekends, group home for foster youth, and return home on Sunday mornings. When I got home, I took a very long nap, as that was my routine at the time. When I woke up, I saw that I had received messages from the guy in Oakland, out of the blue. He said that he had been thinking of me since it was Christmas time again, and that he wanted to say hi. I asked what he had been doing that Friday, and he said that he had simply worked, gone home, and gone to bed. I told him what I experienced, and he had no more answers than I did. I had several dreams later that someone was relaying his passing on to me at a party in Oakland, but shrugged it off as my own fears towards his struggle with alcohol. Nonetheless, I run Google checkups on him every once in a while just in case. This past winter, I found out that he had passed away at the age of 41 in 2021. I'm not sure how. A tragic accident is passively cited in his obituary, and will likely never ask, but it feels like I was being warned and did nothing to reach out to him. I was quite unaware of doppelganger folklore at the time, but had so many theories. This all fits the classic doppelganger definition so well, so I thought I would share. About a year ago, my girlfriend and I were on a trail to Lamoille Lake in northern Nevada. It's about 1.5 miles each way, I think, and usually pretty well populated. It was that day as well. There were at least a handful of people on the trail here and there. Plenty down at the trailhead parking lot, and it was otherwise a totally normal sunny day. Evening began to come, and we started heading back down, not wanting to be out when it got dark, as there was no cell service up there for quite a distance, and it was just an afternoon weekend hike. We started down the trail, and I got the slightest hint of a bad feeling, like we definitely needed to get back to our car before it got dark. I think that's just generally common sense and doesn't need to be prompted by a sixth sense or something. Still, I kept an eye out as we went. Weirdly, absolutely nothing happened until we were maybe 300 yards from the parking lot. The trees had largely been left behind as we descended in elevation, and bushes, large and small, were there instead. There was a creek that ran through to our right. Ahead of us, maybe 50 yards, was a lone woman and her medium-sized dog on a leash. I had my head on a swivel the whole way down because I was trying to keep an eye out and make sure that hint of a bad feeling didn't amount to anything I was also carrying. This woman was ahead of us by about the same distance for a good while down the trail, and I felt somewhat responsible for her safety as well. Mountain lions are known to live higher up in those mountains, the Rubies, and she was pretty much in sight the whole time, so I was trying to keep an eye out for her too. As we were walking, me and my girlfriend both hear what seemed like a big boulder sliding and grating along a stone surface. It lasted a few seconds, and we were both looking at the stone surface mountain slope, maybe 600 yards to our left, fully expecting to see a landslide of some sort. But there was nothing, and daylight was still good enough that I think if there was something to see on that front, we would have seen it. I immediately looked to the lady ahead of us, and just a second later, she and her dog started booking it. Right as they did, a herd of deer came sprinting out of the bushes away from the boulder sound. It must have been closer than it sounded. They ran across the creek and kept going to our right. After pausing for a second to discuss what that weird sound might have been, we hurried along as well, and I drew my gun. We passed the same little section where the lady was when she took off, and thankfully, nothing happened. We didn't hear or see anything in those bushes, though I'm not surprised. A whole herd of deer was in there, and we couldn't see them until they ran out, despite being at a higher elevation at the time. We quickly made it back to the parking lot, and I put my gun back in its holster. It felt safer getting back to the pavement for some reason. We caught up with the woman and the dog. She was catching her breath and pacing a little. We asked if she heard the weird sound, and she said that she heard the loud bouldery sound, and then off to her left, directly close by, right where the deer came running from, she distinctly heard a big, low growl after the boulder sound, and then she heard the deer coming and ran to get out of the way. The deer probably would have run right into her if she hadn't moved. Watching this happen from a ways above and behind just a minute or two previous, they came out onto the trail right where she had been a second before. We determined it might have been a mountain lion. I'm all for believing that, but I still have two questions. 1. Why did I get the feeling that we needed to leave, even subtly, around 45 minutes before anything strange happened? And 2. Why or how did whatever it was make a big sound of a boulder scraping along, not tumbling, but sliding, very different sounds? And then there was a clear growl heard by the woman, but not by us. I think that indicates that there was something absolutely in those bushes, but I'm very confused about the bigger sound. I doubt the same animal made a huge boulder scraping sound, and the deer didn't run, and then the same creature made a normal growl sound that came from that same place, and that was what scared the deer off. I don't know what I believe about this, but it was certainly a strange experience. I live somewhere in North Carolina. It's not a small city by any means, but it's basically a highway town at its core. I've lived here for 10 plus years. On the night in question, I was with my ex. We'll refer to her as Z. This was right around the time when COVID-19 restrictions had yet to be fully lifted, so Z invited me for a walk. She was finishing up her online courses for the semester, one being physical activity, so we'd often walk around her neighborhood to reach a daily amount of steps or something. Anyway, we head out on this walk. It's around 7 to 8 p.m., so on our way out, the sun is already setting. We stick to the street, as there isn't a sidewalk and we're just walking through the neighborhood. I've been down this area hundreds of times. I've drove there nearly every day to be with Z during the pandemic. It's just your average single-story, cookie-cutter, every house looks identical neighborhood. On our way back to the house, it's dusk, a weird time of day, especially on this evening. It was almost a gray-looking atmosphere, but still illuminated enough to see the streets. Z is on a phone call for the entirety of the way back, so I'm just taking in my surroundings and waiting for the walk to be finished. That's when I see it, whatever this thing was. About 3 houses down, mid-jump, arms and legs fully outstretched and leaping across the street. It lands on the other side in an instant, with barely enough time to register that anything had even happened at all. At the time, it felt like a hallucination, something fictional that my brain had just conjured up out of boredom or lack of visual content. It happened so quickly, but this flash frame is burned into my memory now, and is something that I'll probably never forget. Firstly, it was huge and 100% silent. I only caught sight of it flying across the street and landing underneath a car. It was fully outstretched and took up almost the entirety of the street. Even with its hands on the ground, its rear legs were still stretched from the jump and extended far beyond the halfway point of this 2-lane road. I can only guess the size of this thing was 10 to 20 feet in length. It looked extremely thin, but startlingly human from the waist up, 100% dark gray. Its arms seemed to be car length, with large claws, and its legs were bowed in a way that reminded me of a dog. The only feature I couldn't make out was its face. It seemed completely black, but scarily human. Again, at the time, I had no idea if what I saw was some sort of weird animal or just a hallucination. Even so, I kept my eyes glued to where I had seen this hallucination land. As I got closer and closer to the car, I almost wanted to freak out. Z was still on the phone though, so I decided to keep quiet and inspect the car for myself as we walked by. I turned my head as we slowly passed the vehicle. At this point, I'm convincing myself that what I had seen couldn't be possible, but I just couldn't bring myself to peer and look under that car. As we walk away, I turn back a few times, really trying to process if I lost my mind for a moment or not. By the time we got home, I almost feel embarrassed. Did I just have a stare down with a car for absolutely no reason? By the time we walk inside Z's house, she's off the phone. We were kind of bummed that our walk was void of conversation, so we just catch up and converse for the next half hour. The hallucination had almost completely left my mind at this point. We just ended up going about our usual business. Honestly, I was just happy to be spending time with my partner. I was ready to accept that what had happened earlier was nothing more than my imagination. I had forgotten about the experience almost entirely, until Z asked me out of almost nowhere, "Did you see something jump across the street earlier?" My grandmother was Wiccan and could hear, see, and sense things, and that was passed down to me and one of my cousins. I've seen, heard, and experienced a lot of things, but nothing really bad, until my mom had gotten a little doll from Africa that she kept on top of her entertainment center. I had bad vibes from that doll from day one, and I told my mom a few times that she should get rid of it. But being the extreme realist that she is, she always said it was just a doll. She liked it, and it was directly from Africa, and it was staying where it was. It was initially just a sense of unease, but that feeling grew stronger to where you could feel the hate and malevolence this doll was giving out. It came to a head one evening when I was over visiting. The doll sat in the center of the unit, looking out over the living room. My mom was at the far end of the living room, and I was in the kitchen getting a drink, when she went silent in the middle of her sentence. I came back in to see her standing and staring at the doll. It was no longer in the center, but was now at the edge and had turned 90 degrees and appeared to be staring at my mom with such fierce hatred that even my mom could feel it. She got as far as, "What?" when the doll fell from the entertainment unit and onto the floor. My mom let out a small shriek while I grabbed a sheet and threw it over the doll and called my grandma to let her know what happened. She said she would be right over and to wait outside until she got there. Even getting to the front door was a challenge, as this thing was draining the energy from the room and we were getting weaker until we got outside and things were a little better. My grandma got there about 10 minutes later, and I followed her into the house. My grandmother was a sweet little English lady with a sweet disposition and never had a bad word about anyone. She walked into the living room and with a strong voice that I had never heard from her before, said, "All right, that's enough." She walked over, lifted up the sheet, grabbed the doll, and put it in a small beige bag she was carrying with her. She walked over to my mom, and reverting back to the sweet little old English lady, said, "Don't worry, dear, I'll cleanse the doll and you won't have to worry about it anymore." Then she got back in her van and drove off. My mom was still a little freaked and spent the night at my place, as there was no way she was staying at her house that night. I went back to my grandparents' house about a week later. My grandma went up to the attic and came back down with the doll. My mom shrank back, but my grandma handed the doll to me. I took it, and I felt absolutely nothing. Whatever she had done to the doll worked. My mom tentatively took it and relaxed. It's back at my mom's house now, but not on the entertainment center. It's on a bookshelf in a well-lighted corner of the living room. I'm a service tech who gets into a lot of homes, businesses, and abandoned warehouses. 20 years ago, I had a work order for a local residence to service their water softener. I entered the home, met with the missus, and headed for the basement, where the equipment was located. As I worked, I could hear the mister working in his workshop a few doors away. He was cheery. I could tell from his pleasant tune that he whistled over and over. I finished up about 25 minutes later and wrote up the billing invoice, and at that, I walked over to the woodshop to explain it to him. When I approached the door to the shop, all noises stopped. I peeked my head inside the room. It was empty and dark. The saws and equipment neatly stowed with little evidence that they had been used recently. I could have sworn, but maybe he must have gone upstairs when I was working. So I proceeded to deliver the slip upstairs to the missus. I mentioned to her that I was going to explain the repair to her hubby, but he had left his shop before I could see him. It was at that point that nearly all the color drained from her face and distress obviously appeared. I kept hearing that tune that he whistled in my head, and I blew a few phrases so she could hear. She began to tear up and told me that her husband had passed away suddenly a few weeks back. The tune I whistled was so familiar to her, as he had whistled it over many years, but especially when he was woodworking in his shop. As I left, I couldn't help thinking about how the spirit must have been watching over his living wife, and I wasn't fearful. Nice, huh? When I was younger, I used to live next to this very old and rundown church. This church was one of the town's original buildings from the late 1800s. It had been remodeled a few times, but mostly the building had maintained its original design. It was a large, square, white plaster-sided building with a very short bell tower capping the top of the roof. The church had gone through several owners for various reasons, and had always been used for several purposes while I was growing up. When I was very young, it was basically abandoned, and kids would sometimes play in it. I never really liked being in that church. It just made me feel so uncomfortable, so I would rarely go into the church, even when other kids were there. At some point, it became a night school. The teenagers that had to attend the school would say they would see spooky things out of the corner of their eyes, or hear strange sounds when no one was talking. Very shortly after becoming a night school, they moved the school to another building. They said it was because they needed more space, but all the teens joked that it was because the teachers were frightened of the building. After being empty for another year or so, it was rented out to a family who turned it into their house. The family was lower middle class, just like my family, and they rented it because it was cheap. Their living room was basically the bottom floor of the building, since the church hadn't been remodeled into a proper house. It was just being used as one. Even then, I didn't really like that church. It was directly attached to our yard, and I wouldn't get too close to it at night because it creeped me out so much. Despite the creepy church house, our families became fairly close in the short time that they lived there, and my mom would babysit their infant for them pretty often. I was around 13 at the time, and was friends with the 2 other kids who lived in the church. They would tell me that they thought the church was a little creepy at night too, but nothing really interesting had happened to them. One night, my younger sister got scared of something and woke up. She said she heard something weird outside her window and wanted me to check it out for her. Her bedroom window is on the 2nd floor and faces the church. Now, I'm not super keen on doing this, but I feel like I have to do it anyway. I get to her window and I look outside. To my relief, I don't see anything of interest. No marks on the window, nothing outside in the yard, and no cliched branches rubbing on the window. I begin to tell her that it's fine, when we both hear what sounds like a baby crying in the distance. I realize it must be the neighbor's baby, and tell her not to worry about it. I just think to myself that their baby must be incredibly loud for us to hear it over here. I take another look out the window to see a woman in a red dress walking by the church window, cradling what must have been the baby. I get chills down my spine and look away quickly. I assume it was my neighbor's mom and decide to go back to bed. A few months later, it's the neighbor's turn to babysit us for my mom. My sister and I have to stay the night in the creepy church with our neighbors. The neighbor kid showed us around the house to make sure we knew where everything was. The two kids' bedrooms were upstairs next to the nursery they set up for the baby. Mom and Dad's room was downstairs because it was the biggest bedroom. The kitchen and bathroom were downstairs and attached to the living room. It was an interesting layout for a house, but it was obviously still just a church, with a living room set up in the main hall. We spent most of the night watching cartoons and movies, and were successfully distracted for the majority of the evening. Eventually, it was time for bed, so we rolled out our sleeping bags and went to sleep in the living room. At some point in the night, we were all woken up by the baby crying from upstairs. It was annoyingly loud. We hoped the baby would just stop on its own, but after waiting a while, the neighbor kid decided it was time to wake up their parents. The mom came out of their room wondering what was wrong, and we told her the baby was crying. She looked really confused and listened quietly for a moment and obviously heard the baby crying. She then turned around and woke up her husband and said something to him in a frightened tone. It was dark and we couldn't see much into their bedroom, but after a moment she came out of their bedroom, holding their sleeping baby. The crying continued. Her husband comes out of their bedroom, holding a broom like a baseball bat, and tells us to stay downstairs. We are all terrified and go into the living room to sit on the couch and wait for him to come back. As he climbs the squeaking stairs, we can still hear the baby crying, while their baby is still fast asleep. Suddenly, the crying stops. You can hear the husband walking around on the old floorboards, creaking with every step. He yells, "Come on out, or I'll call the police." No response. After a while of creaking floorboards, he comes back downstairs and shrugs his shoulders. Probably an injured animal or something, must have scared it away, he says. Despite that, we all spent the rest of the evening by the couch together. They moved away shortly after, and the church remained uninhabited for several years after that. A few years after the baby incident, I became friends with someone who had moved into the house across the street from the church after I had moved away. When I learned that he lived across the street from where I used to live, I told him that I always hated that church. He agreed, and before I could tell him my story, he told me one of his own. He told me that he had once been getting home late when he thought he heard someone yelling in the distance. He wasn't able to make out any words, but he was sure that he heard somebody yelling from far away, so he started looking around. He spotted a woman in a red dress circling the inside of the bell tower of the church, walking where there used to be a floor. His story made me shudder as I remembered the woman outside my sister's window. In 2006, I was working on a kids' outdoor rec site in France. We had 90 or so staff sharing 2 washing machines. Inevitably, you'd find or lose the odd item of clothing, but no biggie. If you find something, take it to the daily morning meeting and someone will claim it. A month or so into the season, I find a sock in my laundry as I was hanging it up. I knew it wasn't mine because it was a small, lacy girl's sock, and I'm a large man. I brought it to the morning meeting, but nobody claimed it. I assumed the owner must have been on a day off, so I brought the sock to the morning meeting a couple of more times. With nobody claiming the sock, I chucked it into the drawer in my cabin and forgot about it. I figured one of my colleagues had forgotten it was theirs and would realize that they had an odd sock and would be grateful for its return. I know it's a lot of effort over one sock, but we were 30 miles from the nearest village, and buying new socks involved a serious outing. Months passed, and I forgot about the mystery sock. We got a bunch of new staff mid-season. It's always fun having new staff. There's always parties as everyone's getting to know each other. One morning, one of our new recruits brought a sock to the morning meeting. She'd lost one and wondered if anyone found it. Yeah, I've got your missing sock, but it arrived before you. I went to my cabin and got it, and they were a pair. Same size, color, same lacy frilly bit around the top, same wear on the heel, and same dirty faded white sole. When I was a kid living in a rural town, my room was on the ground floor, making the whole sneaking out thing a lot easier, and I never got caught. One night, my buddies and I snuck out on our bikes. We lived close to Interstate 80 in central Pennsylvania, and we headed toward one of the underpasses of the highway. Next to this bridge was a huge billboard, always lighting up the night sky with its advertising. It was a good place to hang out. This night, however, was dark. Not a star or moon in the sky. The only light was provided by that billboard. We all sat under this bridge around 2 a.m. when we could hear hoofbeats in the distance coming closer. That in and of itself didn't frighten us. Hell, we live square in the heart of Amish country. But 2 a.m.? Very odd. As the footfalls came closer and closer, we laughed and shot the bull about this girl or that one, when suddenly our giant billboard went black, just as the hoofbeats were on us. We freaked out when we saw the darkest buggy we have ever seen in our young lives pass under the bridge where we were sitting. The horse's eyes seemed to glow red, and due to the chill in the air of that fall evening, the steam poofed out of the horse's nose. From there, it was a free-for-all scramble to mount our bikes and get the hell out of there. As we each headed our separate directions, we found that the billboard lighting went back up, and the horse and buggy were gone. What the hell? Where did it go? And why did the billboard go black? This happened in my childhood home in an urban neighborhood in Veracruz, Mexico. We have since moved out. We shared walls with our neighbors, and my room's window on the second floor was facing our back neighbor's roof. This is in southeastern Mexico, where houses are designed to have large windows to let cool air in. It happened on Christmas morning, 2005, when I was 10 years old. I woke up around 4:30 a.m. with the anticipation of finding Christmas presents under the Christmas tree. I found my presents under the tree and brought them up to my room. As I began unwrapping them, I felt a presence coming from the window. I turned my head towards the window and saw some sort of white humanoid entity staring at me from our neighbor's roof. It was all white and seemed to be about 6'4", with no facial features, although I could feel it staring at me. I screamed and closed my eyes. When I opened my eyes again, it was gone. I used up all the bravery I had in me and got up close to the windows and shades, then became unable to move or sleep until sunrise around 6. I tried telling my parents about it, but it just got dismissed as me being imaginative. Ever since, I get terrible anxiety if the shades or windows are open when I try to sleep, and I still don't fully understand what I saw. I lost an earring that had much sentimental value, amber-colored, teardrop-shaped. I purchased the pair while in deep grief for my late husband. I was visiting the city we went to college when I lost one of the earrings. I was at the shop of his best friend, a workshop for a plant grower. Several people were there, most of them good friends of my late husband. It was the 5th anniversary of his death. I was putting the earrings on, as I hadn't fully accessorized yet because I was traveling, and the earrings were in my pocket. I was putting them on and fumbled the second one. I couldn't find the earring anywhere. I swept the floor looking for it. Nada. I spent 20 minutes looking. I told a friend there about the sentimental value, but we didn't find the earring. When I got home a couple of days later, I put the single earring remaining on my jewelry holder. A month or so later, I was picking out jewelry for an outfit, and the pair was there. Both of them, amber-colored teardrops. One night when I was about 15, I was home alone for the evening. I lived in an older 2-story house, and I often felt uncomfortable being there by myself at night, especially in my room, since it had the door to our creepy attic. Since I was so uncomfortable upstairs, I spent the evening watching TV downstairs, adequately distracted from being by myself. At some point, I decided I was ready for bed, and went upstairs to my room. I shared a room and bunk bed with my older brother, but he usually got home late, if at all, and went to bed way after me. Our bed was pushed into the corner of the room against the wall. The bottom bunk was mine. I was pretty tired, so I laid down and fell asleep almost immediately. Shortly after that, I woke up to my brother slapping against the wall by sticking his arm through the gap between the side of the bed and the wall. It's dark, and I can clearly make out his arm smacking against the wall. Annoyed, I tell him to stop, and then roll over and try to go back to sleep. Of course, he keeps slapping the wall, but harder now. I'm getting angry, so I tell him if he doesn't stop, I'm going to hit him. Unsurprisingly, he doesn't listen and starts slapping the wall even harder. At this point, I'm done with his shenanigans, and I roll over to punch him in the arm. Instead of hitting him, I just hit the wall. A little freaked out that he pulled his arm away so quickly, I get out of bed and rip his covers off to reveal no one there. This scared the hell out of me, and with nowhere else to go, I went downstairs and turned the TV way up and spent the rest of the evening frightened and alone. In 2007, a friend came around to my house. We were going rock climbing, but first, coffee. I boiled the kettle, took 2 mugs, placed a spoon of instant coffee in both, no sugar or milk for either. We chatted about the plan for the day while the kettle boiled. Then, when it was boiling and steaming up my small kitchen, I poured the boiling water into the 2 mugs, stirred, handed him one, took one myself, carefully took a sip, and it was stone cold, like I'd made it with water from a bottle in the fridge. Matt, is your coffee okay?" He looked at me quizzically and said everything was fine. I showed him my stone cold coffee. Having just watched me make it, neither of us had any clue how. It was the early summer of 2004, and I was living in Flagstaff, Arizona. My studio happened to be close to Buffalo Park, which is part of an amazing meadow on the southeastern base of Mount Eldon that almost completely fills with sunflowers during the summer months. It's a beautiful spot of land. This is where I would go for my morning runs because there is a measured 2-mile loop around the meadow. Most often, I would run up from my studio up to the park, do the 2-mile loop twice, then run home to complete 6 miles. It was the kind of morning you would expect from a mountain town in early summer at sunrise, and I was starting my usual running route near the intersection of Cedar and West. I hopped onto the trail that wraps around the high school and goes uphill alongside Cedar to a footbridge that crosses over it and leads directly into the front gates of Buffalo Park. It felt really good to breathe that air in and hear the memorable sound of my feet going over that bridge. Great vibes. As I approached the entrance, I veered right around the big water tank on a secondary trail that skirts the main gate because there was a big family clogging the way. Since I was already treading to the right, I took the counterclockwise option around the Buffalo Park loop. I would choose this direction most often because that puts a nice calf-burning climb in the last leg of the loop. Everything about the run was typical. A few other runners, some cyclists heading straight through on the Arizona Trail, and a handful of young moms with strollers. I had already finished 1 lap and was about to close the second lap, which involves that climb I mentioned at the end. To get that climb, one has to take a right at a fork in the path and run down into a small gully, then run up the other steeper side. This gully is filled with trees, pine, oak, aspen, and some underbrush. This gully is also filled with squirrels as a result, and I privately called it the Squirrel Holler portion of the trail. I veered right at the fork and headed down into the trees of Squirrel Holler. I instantly had the sense I was going to have some kind of interaction in there, so I wiped my nose of any drips and held myself up a bit straighter, as one does, because the trail is more snug there, and I aim to be inspiring more than repulsive. I ran farther in, but still couldn't hear or see any other runners yet, only the squirrels barking overhead. The trail goes down, crosses the gully, and immediately cuts up to the left. And it was as I came upon this junction that I saw what I had been sensing. Coming up on my right, from farther downhill, was a white shape moving through the trees along the base of the gully. At first, I thought I was seeing a large man running hunched over under a white blanket or something. But just after a moment, I noticed there were no legs underneath, and the shape wasn't as defined as a blanket. I gauged its speed and trajectory, and realized I would absolutely collide with it where the trail crosses, so I slowed to a stop. This is when I got a really good look at what I was seeing. It was similar to white fog or smoke, but also kind of shimmery or pearlescent. It was roughly 8 to 10 feet across and about my height of 5'7", and thickly transparent. I stood still as it moved with determination between the trees and approached the path, when it suddenly stopped right at the edge and just stayed there, roiling expectantly. I was all chills, and my neck hairs were standing up, and my mind was going at what I was seeing. But I somehow got the notion that this interaction was a question of courtesy. So I instinctively bowed a bit, and motioned with both of my hands for this cloud to have the right of way. And that shimmering mass of mist picked up and continued its course over the trail and up the gully. I watched it for a second or two and continued with slower steps than usual up around the trail and eventually out of sight of this thing. The last I saw, it seemed to be heading into a denser area of undergrowth. I ran out into the sun, toward the front gate, and kept throwing glances back to see if anything cloud-like was coming out of the trees, or zooming over the meadow, but there was nothing noticeable, and no other people were responding to anything strange. For the whole final mile back to my studio, I just went over and over the event and didn't even register my surroundings as I ran. I could only see this strange, sparkly, wet, misty, amorphous shape waiting patiently for me to yield the right of way. It was almost like bad special effects from the 80s, and I still laugh to this day. Let me start by saying that my brother and I are extremely experienced desert campers, and we have lived near deserts pretty much our whole lives. I have never in my 20 years of life, ever for 1 second, believed in anything paranormal or anything to do with evil spirits. Unlike my brother, who has always sensed presences and has been able to see mostly what we call jinn, also known as demons. Until last night, which is safe to say, marks the last time that we'll be camping alone in the desert. We always have the same place we like to go when we camp with minimum effort, and our day started as normal as ever. But as we got closer and closer to our destination, I saw my brother's mood completely shift. And when I asked him what was wrong, he shrugged me off and told me to just keep driving. When we arrived, I felt completely fine, but my brother was still unusually quiet. It was around 1 p.m. at that point, and we were planning on leaving around 12 or 1 a.m. Because of the heat, we made the terrible decision to set up under a few trees and a source of water, which, in Middle Eastern culture, is where the jinns live at night. Not that I believed at that time, of course. However, we still set up our camp and continued on as normal. Now, my brother always says that when he feels a presence, or several in this case, he gets extremely unlucky. First, he almost dropped a box of coals on his foot. Then, he spilt an entire bottle of Coke on his phone. Then, he dropped it into the sand and then proceeded to smash his elbow on the edge of the chair he was sitting on, which is now very swollen. And last, but certainly not least, when he was looking through one of our boxes, he felt something cold and sharp press right against his arm, and he realized it was an unsheathed knife. He packed it with its case the previous night, and he later said it felt like something pushed his hand into it, right where his veins are. All of these events consecutively, within a matter of a few hours, was certainly making both of us uneasy, and I, for the life of me, couldn't figure out why he was suddenly so unlucky. As I was starting to question his clumsiness, a random couple appeared out of nowhere, informing us that they were stuck in the sand and needed help. We drive a Land Cruiser, and they had a Nissan Altima, so we didn't expect to encounter so many issues that we did. We first dug them out without any issues, but as we pushed them out of the sand, they got stuck again. If you know anything about dune bashing or desert camping, then you understand the physics behind how wheels get stuck in the sand, and the way this Nissan was stuck was incredibly unusual. It was literally stuck somewhere with plenty of space available for grip. And later, my brother said that as we were digging them out of the sand, that's when he started feeling an evil presence around us, but he didn't want to say anything as to not ruin the trip and freak me out. So we ended up having to tow them out of the sand, which, again, was far harder than it had to be. First, our tow strap broke off their bumper. Tow straps cost about $200 and was fine, but their bumper was slightly damaged. Then we almost got stuck ourselves, and a 20-minute job took more like 90. When we came back to our camp, we noticed how everything around us had gotten unusually quiet. The area we were in has hundreds of birds around, and as far as we have seen, 3 cats who sometimes pay us a visit. but there wasn't a single noise at all, other than our fire, which was dying out unusually quickly. It had gotten dark quickly, so we scrambled to build a fire to cook our dinner before we were asked to help the couple. And I had noticed the silence, but it didn't bother me. However, my brother suddenly grabbed my hand as we were sitting down to eat, and said, with clear fear in his voice, that we should do so as quickly as possible, and that he didn't feel safe. To ease both of our minds, we prayed. We're Christians, so of course we thought it would help. But I think it accelerated everything that happened, and just made whatever was there with us angry. We finished our dinner, and me being the skeptic, I was completely fine and pretty much just humoring my brother, until I started getting the nagging feeling that it was time to pack up and leave. It hit me like a wave, and I was quite taken aback by the feeling, so I voiced it to my brother, and he agreed that we should pack up right away and leave. We started packing up at a normal pace, and that's when we heard a sound very close to us on the opposite side of the pond, which wasn't that big. Something that I could only describe as the sound of death itself, and it seemed to go on for several minutes. When I say that we looked at each other in absolute fear, I genuinely mean I was ready to have a heart attack right there and then. At that point, after being frozen for a few minutes, and quite reasonably so, after hearing that bellowing screech so close to us, we turned on the car, drove it back so we could see with better light, and just started throwing everything into the car without much care, but with a whole lot of urgency. Sound of twigs snapping and footsteps all around us, then the shadows from behind the trees. I tried to get the shadows to change shape, walking around the trees and moving the lights, but nothing. It looked like there were people just staring at us the whole time, and you could really feel it, too. We felt like we weren't alone, and that we weren't with friendly entities either. We also noticed that all 3 cats were huddled right behind our car, away from the trees, so they weren't the ones snapping the twigs. I felt like whatever was there was getting closer, and I have never felt anything like it. It was a gut feeling, and you just know it's one of those natural instincts that you shouldn't ignore. Thankfully, we were able to pack up quickly, but it was still very silent, and at this point it was around 8 p.m., and it was unusual for that. I personally think I was most terrified as I was driving away back onto the main dirt path to leave the desert. I know cars very well. I know how they drive in the sand, and I know our car especially well because we've had it for so long. I could instantly tell that the steering was off and completely fighting against me. The sound of twigs snapping was still all around us, and it was loud enough to be heard over the sounds of the car. And on the path was what seemed to be like every bird in the area, just standing there and staring at us until we got close enough to force them to walk, not even fly, away. At one point, my brother just grabbed my shoulder and told me very sternly to just keep looking in front of me, and under no circumstance to look through the window. We were in a part of the desert where we had to pretty much drive through the whole of the accessible areas to get onto the highway, and there wasn't a single person around us. The only thing we saw was a very clearly abandoned Toyota Hilux, positioned behind a small dune and hidden by the trees, but was far enough from our campsite to be easily ruled out as the source of the original screech. The worst thing I saw was as we were getting close to the exit, we saw standing in the middle of the path, staring directly at us, a deer. I've only ever seen one deer in the 16 years of living here, and that was in someone's garden as a pet. It's safe to say that I was in complete shock, and the deer wasn't moving at all, until I got close enough that we could practically smell the thing before it slowly walked off the path while looking right at us. We quickly moved past the deer, and again my brother, with a grasp and then very sternly said to keep my eyes right on the road. I asked him when we got on the highway what it was that he kept seeing, and he very reluctantly told me that he kept seeing large figures around us anytime we went through a bend, and they were all pointing either right at us or ahead of us. We were still yet to encounter anyone, but we still very clearly heard sounds all around us. When I saw the exit, I was happy as I ever have been, but that quickly faded when once again we saw another deer standing right in the middle of the road, slowly walking away and looking right at us. Except this time, it didn't really look like a deer, more like a kangaroo mixed with a deer. And its eyes were milky, and it looked rotten and horrible. But I didn't much care. I just stepped on the gas, and fortunately, it had gotten out of the way in time. When you exit the desert, you can either turn right onto a long stretch of highway, or you can go left and go through a small town and then take the back streets to a parallel highway. As I was about to turn right, my brother once again, with the same tone of voice, said to go to the town and to go left. Later, he once again said that he saw a line of figures pointing ahead of us. So if we would have gone that way, we wouldn't have made it home in one piece. Thankfully, as we made it farther and farther away and closer to our home, the gut feeling of being watched was going away, and of course, having never experienced something like this before, I was distraught and wanted to talk about it. My brother told me as we were going home that because we were alone, the jinn wanted to mess with us, that they wanted to scare us and most likely cause us harm. He also said that they caused bad luck and that he could feel them the second we entered the desert, which explains his clumsiness all day and the car that got stuck in such an unusual manner. This is also my younger brother by 3 years, and naturally any time he ever told me about this sort of thing, I always just dismissed it as him scaring himself. I can excuse the sounds we heard and the shadows we saw that night. I can excuse the gut feeling of just being scared. But I cannot excuse the 2 deers we saw staring right at us, and I cannot excuse the car just randomly fighting against me as I was driving. The deer completely freaked me out, as did the tone of my brother's voice, and it's safe to say, we're not going camping there again. I'm never dismissing my brother when it comes to this kind of thing again, and I am so thankful that we made it home safely. A few years ago, my family and I were driving in the Canyonlands at night. This was near Kayenta, Arizona. For those who haven't driven that stretch of road at night, it's pitch black since the road is in the valley of the canyon, and the canyon walls shield any ambient light except from the stars above. The road is also long and winding, so it's a white-knuckle drive. Anyway, about 10 minutes into the drive, my brother, who was driving, and I navigating in the front seat, noticed these fluorescent orbs surrounding the car. They were yellow, but maybe more of a highlighter color. My first thought was some sort of insect, like fireflies, but the orbs would form patterns, like they would all group up, then disperse, then reformate around the car. The whole car was bathed in their light. We never felt fear or danger, but they were there for a good 30 minutes, and perhaps 10 to 15 miles. Ironically, we got into a major accident 3 days later, not too far from there, in the same vehicle. Everyone walked out with minor injuries when the first responders expected 5 people dead. I went to work at 6:30 a.m. as usual. Everything is normal up to this point, until I reached the building where the security guard wasn't there and the gate was open. I thought to myself, maybe he just went somewhere. So I went in and parked my car in the usual spot. Now to explain the layout, there are 3 elevators and facing them, one door behind, is the stairs. And when you face the elevators on your right, there is a big door, and on the left, there's the water closet door on every floor. I developed the habit of taking the stairs since I worked on the 4th floor, and I try to be active. So as usual, I went into the building and opened up the stairs door. It was weirdly dim, but I thought nothing of it, and I climbed to the ground floor, passing the closed door, and the next flight of stairs was even darker. I heard a weird low rumble from up the stairs. Going up, I can see the door is open and it's dark. When I reached the door, I was stunned. The 3 elevator doors are not there. It's just a wall, with the small monitors glowing faint red, all of them saying G. I peeked from outside. I noticed that the other doors are missing too. It's just a dark room, with only the elevator monitors. I partially closed the door, and noticed that the sign that says 1st floor wasn't there. I felt cold, so I ran to the 4th floor and went to my office, trying to process what I saw. On my break, I went down the stairs just to find that the door has the sign, and inside, everything is normal. I just spent the summer out in the middle of nowhere in Florida, working at a summer sleepaway camp. This camp owns over 100 acres of pure forest, and before it was a camp, it was an air base. For quite a few years now, maybe much longer, counselors and campers alike have been having weird experiences out there with tall shadow people. Normally there's a lot of fun storytelling at camps, but there is an eerie amount of correlation between some of these stories I've heard about this specific thing. Some of these people who have had these experiences don't know the stories from the others, like new campers having the same experiences as counselors from years ago. They all describe the same thing: tall, thin, shadowy figures of men, sometimes one, sometimes multiple. Their heads are apparently quite a bit taller than the top bunks in the cabins, which is a good 8 feet at least. Campers have described them as having to duck to get through the doorway. Twice in the past couple years, an entire cabin has seen these things. Usually, the counselors would think the kids were trying to mess with them, but because of the sheer amount of these similar reported experiences from campers, it's being taken more seriously. I feel like something weird is going on, especially when multiple 13-year-old boys are crying because they're so freaked out. On one of these occasions, the campers said these shadow figures came into the cabin and pushed their bunks around. The next morning, marks were left on the floor where the bunks had been moved. On a different occasion, only one figure came in and just stood, facing the corner, and the entire cabin witnessed this. On multiple occasions, only one camper has seen this figure, and it has only stared at them from the middle of the room. I myself had not had any strange experiences all summer, except for one. I was in the cabin on the counselor's side, about to take a nap, but was not asleep yet, just recently laid down. I was on my side facing the wall. There was nobody else in the cabin. Twice, within the 45 minutes I was there, something sat on the bed behind me. The cheap mattress sagged a bit, like if a person sat down, and I rolled a little. Of course, when I turned around, nothing's there. I was sitting in the car outside my house with my boyfriend at the time, parked under a tree. The tree had these little acorn things that would fall off. We were just talking, and we heard one hit the top of the car, then land on his shoulder. There were no windows open. The sunroof was closed as it was 9 p.m. It was like it fell through the car. It's a short story, but I always find it funny when I remember. In 2013, I worked as a baker at a small cafe in Prescott, Arizona, called the Wild Iris, still in business. It was a super old building and had a reputation for being haunted among staff. I was quite skeptical at the time about all things paranormal, but also curious, so I spent a week or so inquiring fellow coworkers about their experiences. I would hear stories from other bakers who would come in at 4 a.m., unable to get the lights to work until the 5 a.m. barista arrived. Other stories included things like rags flying off the countertops or moving around while people turned away. Creepy, but not convincing. I remember feeling compelled to have my own experience and felt energetically open to invite something paranormal to happen. During that time, I was scheduled after hours with 2 other coworkers to dust the air ducts. We were instructed to throw tarps over everything so the dust wouldn't dirty the workspaces. I was in the bakery, which was essentially a tiny workspace connected to the coffee area. I threw a large tarp over one of the rolling speed racks, a tall portable shelving unit, that was filled with empty squeeze bottles for caramel and chocolate sauces. Once I got to the top of my stepladder to begin dusting, I noticed a single squeeze bottle sitting on top of the tarp. There was no storage above the speed rack, so I had no idea how that bottle managed to get on top of the tarp that I had just thrown over it. I was so baffled, and so were my coworkers. However, I wasn't convinced it was a ghost. The next night, I was scheduled and told everyone about my experience. Eventually, it was just me and one other coworker, the barista, closing the shop. There was only one customer left on the opposite side of the room. I think it was a young man reading by the front door. We spent all night discussing paranormal stuff and really creeping ourselves out. It got to the point where I had to stop talking about things with her because I was so unnerved by the energy that we were stirring up. Shortly thereafter, I bent over to get a trash bag out of the cabinet beneath the sink when I heard a noise from behind and above me. It sounded like a woman's voice, but a combination of a growl and spoken words, and it was textural. I have never heard anything like it before. It was like someone was speaking from another dimension, almost staticky. I immediately froze and spent a few seconds trying to logically understand what I had just heard. I knew it wasn't the song playing on the radio because it was much louder than that, and I knew it wasn't my coworker behind me. But after finding no other explanation, I turned around and faced her and said, "What was that noise?" My coworker looked at me and said, "I thought that was you." We both froze in disbelief, and at that time, we were both equidistant from the espresso bar that had several coffee cups stacked on top. After a couple of seconds of just staring at each other, we both noticed something on top of the espresso bar moving and looked at the same time. One of the cups floated a couple of inches into the air, wiggled a bit side to side, and then lowered itself back down. We both looked at each other to confirm what we had just seen, and then ran to the bathroom on the side of the building, laughing hysterically, flooded with adrenaline. I was just so utterly in awe of what had just happened. I remember saying out loud something like, "Okay, I get it now. I believe you." Not the scariest thing ever, but to this day remains the most bizarre and unexplainable thing I have ever witnessed. When we were young, my cousins and I had a bush house at the end of the back garden just before the garden opened up on the heath. Due to me being a full-time wheelchair user from birth, it was Gran's idea that instead of having a treehouse that had to be climbed, it would be safer and more practical to have a bush house that all of us kids could use. Even though we protested greatly, although I am disabled, I frequently used to climb trees in my local parks and over the heath, with the help of my cousins, obviously. But Gran's word was final, and we never argued with her, as she was a beautiful and lovely matriarch, but also as tough as old boots, and very scary when pushed. So we busied ourselves on choosing an appropriate bush for our new play area. On selecting a perfect one, Gran delegated tasks to the older boys to clear the outer area of the bush, and also make a little hollow inside it, with pieces of spare wood on the ground to serve as a basic floor so that my little wheelchair could run safely and easily inside it. Gran was reasonably young at the time, and while the boys were doing the heavy work, she arranged us younger ones in getting furniture, supplies, and accessories to make our new play space cozy and comfortable for us all. A year later, and our bush house was in full use. In the daytime, us younger ones played in it after school. On weekends and holidays, and in the evenings and nights, it was a place where the older cousins could have some privacy, away from the eyes of Gran and Mom to do whatever they did. Our bush house was cozy though. We got chairs, beanbags, and floor cushions donated by relatives and friends of the family. We also had a small table that we made a tablecloth for, and our Auntie Jay made some pretty curtains that we hung up the best that we could. We even had a cupboard where we kept snacks in, and only when older boys or Mom were there, we were allowed to use the camping stove to heat tinned beans and sausages, or pot noodles up and make tea. Gran's bingo friend Jean donated a hand-me-down rug. It was shabby and out of date, but we thought it was beautiful. It was slap bang in the middle of summer holidays, probably in early July, when this happened. Elle and I were 7, and G was 11. Our older cousin G's brother, A, was there earlier, but by 3 o'clock, he had grown tired of hanging around us and had gone out with his mates. The 3 of them were coming back later to make us all dinner on the stove. Elle and I were sitting at the table, playing Beggar Your Neighbor, with a pack of playing cards that we got from the living room cupboard. And G was sitting in the corner of the bush house on the beanbag, reading The Secret Garden. It was just a normal day at home. Nothing unusual or odd occurred, until around 4, when we all heard a sound that was at odds with the peaceful scene. It was between a growl and an owl's hoot, and a man mumbling. We weren't particularly outdoorsy kids, being born and raised in the outskirts of urban London, but being bright little girls, we all knew that owls are nocturnal creatures, and the accompanying sounds that were mixed with the hoots didn't come from the same bird. The weird sounds were joined by a furtive and stealthy rustling coming from the back of the bush house. Actually, it was really near to where G was sitting, and she jumped up, stifling a scream by covering her mouth with her hands. We also saw a dark, dog-like size and shape through the dense foliage of the back of the bush house, which incidentally led straight onto the beginning of the heath, as I said earlier. The strangest thing about this figure was that it was very present and rather ethereal, almost as if the figure was attempting to hide intentionally. Also, throughout this period, there were no other natural sounds, no birdsong, no insect sounds, and no background human noise. Being right in the center of a council estate, you could always hear people talking, cars revving, and dogs barking, all the regular noises of urban community living. But at the time, it was as if the entire world had paused, and us three were the only conscious and present ones, along with the mysterious figure. We didn't know what to do, but we gathered together, and both G and L took one handle of my wheelchair and pulled me back out of our bush house, not taking our eyes off the translucent figure as we went. When we were free from the bush house and close enough to home for us to feel out of danger and safe, we just looked at each other, very doubtfully. G suddenly said, "Stay here. Don't move or speak." She ran to the garden shed and climbed up the side to the manky, rotting roof. I completely lost it, letting out a squeal of utter fear. Quick-witted as usual, Elle put her hand over my mouth and hushed me. Elle and I watched while G looked over the hedgerow, which divided our back garden from the beginning of the heath. From our position, her face was clearly visible. G's expression was a mixture of confusion, surprise, and fright, and her pretty brown eyes looked troubled. We waited for G to come back to us before asking her in earnest what she saw. She didn't answer straight away, but when she did, she said, "It was so strange. I didn't see anything. No dogs, no other animals." She paused, her young mind trying to summon the words to explain what she witnessed. "There was a man. I saw the back of him walking away towards the iron fence." My 7-year-old's mind found it hard to comprehend what G was saying, and one look at Elle told me she was experiencing the same. We both said together, "What man, G? What did he look like?" G sighed, biting her lip, a habit she still has today when she's anxious, worried, or trying to explain something tricky or difficult. "I didn't see him properly. His face and all that. I only saw his back. He did have really long, scruffy hair, though." Her eyes wandered over nervously to the end of the garden, leading out to the very public heath. Elle and I both followed G's gaze. We all shuddered. Nobody spoke for ages. For a long time we sat in silence, G and Elle sitting on the back step, and me in my wheelchair alongside them. Suddenly, I noticed something and exclaimed to the others, "Everything is back to normal. Listen." We all listened. The regular everyday noises had returned. The world appeared to have resumed business as usual. A while later, A and his 2 mates came back, and, sensing some tension between us, they asked us what was up. We did tell them everything, and 2 of them ran out to the back to have a look around. They were gone for about 45 minutes. When they returned, they said they didn't see anything, no strange man, no animals, nothing unusual or dodgy at all. We spent the rest of the day hanging out with the boys, eating dinner in the bush house, and later watching films and eating junk food. We didn't tell Mom about the experience until a few years back, long after we were grown, and we still don't know, or can't explain, what happened that day. A few years ago, I had the most horrific experience of my life. I read a lot of these experiences on here, but nobody seems to be afraid or affected by them like I was. I woke up around 4 a.m., lying in bed with only my eyes open. I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move a muscle. My room had a door that split in half. Don't know what you call it, as it's not a Dutch-style door. Anyhow, as soon as I laid my eyes on the door, it split open, and I could see tens of shadow people slowly making their way into the room. Very slowly they made their way in, but it sounded like hundreds of people murmuring. It sounded like hundreds of people all in one room, talking in a very low voice. All the while, they were making their way into the room, but slowly. I was absolutely frightened and shocked beyond belief. I tried my best to jump out of bed and just run, but I was completely frozen. After what seemed like an eternity, I gained my strength back and they slowly retreated. When I could finally get out of bed, I ran out of the room and turned on all the lights in the house. I took my son with me to the office yesterday because he didn't have school. He brought his backpack with snacks and his phone inside of it. He was carrying the backpack with him when we left the house. I made sure that he had his phone charger and all the stuff he needs in there. We get to the office, he takes off his jacket and sits by one of the computers and places the backpack beside him. I've seen him going on his phone, which was in the backpack. Later, around 3 p.m., we couldn't find his backpack. We panicked because we thought somebody had stole it and his phone was inside of it. We asked around the office, but they didn't see it after 3 p.m., but they remember him having the backpack that morning. We kept looking and couldn't find it. We realized it was probably stolen when he wasn't looking. There were a lot of kids coming in and out for trick-or-treating. We leave the office and go home. I unlock the house. I go in my room, and the backpack is sitting on the bed with all of his stuff inside it, including his phone, which he used yesterday. There are texts and a couple of social media interactions he made using the phone, so we know he had both the backpack and the phone that day. We were shocked. We tried to rationalize it as much as possible, but there is no way that he never brought it with him. There's concrete proof that he did, such as eyewitnesses, him seeing it, him going on his phone, me seeing it, and other people seeing it, and the sent texts, alongside other social media interactions that couldn't have been possible without him having the phone. This was the first time something like this has ever happened to me. I don't know how to feel about it. This experience begins with me and my now fiance going to see some local boxing fights about an hour away in the town over from where we live. We get there, the event finishes up, and then it's nighttime when we're leaving, about 9:30 p.m. As usual, there was a lot of traffic, and we got caught up on a detour through a part of the town that we weren't familiar with, but luckily ended up in the area we were familiar with. As I mentioned before, this town is an hour away from ours and has a lot more stores and things to do than our rural town, so we visit quite often. When we left, we made sure to stop and fill up our gas tank and headed out on the freeway back home. This is where things start happening that neither one of us can explain. So we were driving for about 15 minutes and all was well, until our music turns off on the radio. We didn't think much of it because the radio was not the best. So we continued driving as normal, but we both are just kind of quiet. Out of nowhere, I start noticing that it seems like we're driving on the same piece of road over and over. This is weird because we know the road and the surrounding areas like the back of our hand, so we know when there's turns coming up and exits passing by. There were also no other cars driving by, which is unusual, since it's a freeway and it's always quite busy. At the same time, I start to notice that the gas meter is dropping super fast. While watching, it's just dropping quarter tank by quarter tank, until the gas light came on 5 minutes in and the gas tank was empty. Time is also going by super fast, which was worrying to me as well. Based on the clock, it's been almost an hour since we hit the freeway, but we both stayed quiet. Finally, the radio comes back on and we're able to see the lights from the gas station that's placed right between two towns. As I start to put the gas, it was still empty, no cars in sight, and I was getting this really eerie feeling that something didn't seem right. So we finish up and I tell her we need to get home fast because it felt scary. We finally made it, but the weird thing was that it was 12:30 a.m. when we got home, and we hit the freeway at 10 p.m. So it took us 2.5 hours to get home on a usual, sometimes 45-minute drive. To this day, we can't explain what happened, and I later found out that she noticed all the weird stuff happening, but that we both wanted to stay quiet so we didn't scare each other. When I was about 11, I attended a birthday party on a farm in the middle of nowhere. They pulled out a Ouija board and asked it questions. They were all answered correctly according to the kiddos. I didn't participate, but I was in the room. I was young and I had no idea, and I thought it was just a board game. But ever since that day, I was never the same. I would see and feel a menacing presence. It seemed to follow everywhere I went and affected me emotionally and mentally to the point where my doctor diagnosed me with bipolar disorder. Fast forward to about age 24 or 25. My mom noticed my behavior had gotten worse and erratic, and since she was Buddhist, she brought me to the temple. The priest or monk advised my mom that I had a Western ghost attached to me for the last decade and to send it off with offerings. I believe she recited a prayer and offered it fruits and food. This is normal in Taoism. And since that day, I have felt like such a huge weight has lifted off my shoulders and have felt a lot lighter. But that night, after taking a shower and stepping out, all 10 of the little light bulbs atop my mirror shattered onto me, and I received a cut on my foot. It felt like a last F.U. to me. Fast forward to 8 years later, I experienced something at my family's house when I was visiting last week. I was having an intense disagreement with my fiancé in the living room, and I felt irrationally upset and angry. And I saw an anger in him that I had never seen before. I kept seeing a head pop in and out really fast, multiple times, coming from the wall next to the kitchen hallway. It felt very mischievous. It was a dark shadow. I thought it was a family member checking in or my eyes playing tricks. But it happened multiple times, and I kept seeing it over and over. The next couple days, I felt uneasy and felt like something was watching me. Then my fiancé sees a figure in the house next to us. He would tilt his head, confused as to why this person was staring at him and copying his movements, moving his head right to left, and the shadow would copy him. He was so startled he called out loudly to me. Mind you, my fiancé is a huge skeptic, and paranormal things never happened to him. I knew something was off. There were a couple of nights where I felt like we were sleep-talking to each other, and I'd wake up feeling a presence. It's continued for the last 3 days, so I feel like something may have followed us home. I had a friend over last night. We ran into each other earlier that day, and we made plans to have dinner together. She comes over, and we hang out on the couch for around an hour, just chatting and whatnot. I stand up because I get a phone call, so I go into my bedroom for around 10 to 15 minutes. I go back out, and she's not there anymore. Okay, so she's in the bathroom, right? I sit on the couch and wait for her, but she doesn't come out. I go to check on her. The bathroom is empty. Now I'm weirded out. Did she leave for no reason? I didn't hear the door open or close, and I have a pretty heavy door. I even go outside into the hallway to check to see if she's there for some reason, but she just promptly disappeared. So now I'm thinking that she left for whatever reason, so I call her. It rings for a while, and then she picks up. Immediately, I think it's weird. If she left my flat, she would be on the street, but it's very quiet wherever she is, and it sounds like she just woke up. I ask her why she left my flat, and she had no idea what I was talking about. I get frustrated and ask where she is. I'm at home, taking a nap. Your phone call woke me up. I could hear rustling sheets, and as I said, there's no way her side of the phone call would be so quiet if she just left my flat. I live in a very busy area. I request a video call, and there she is, in her home, in her bed. She has no makeup on, she's in her PJs, looking confused, and her eyes are still kind of puffy from sleeping. I ask her if she remembered coming to my flat. She looked confused. Did we make plans today? She said that after running into me, all we did was chat, say goodbye, and then she went home to take a nap. Obviously, there was no way she got home, removed her makeup, undid her hair, and changed her clothes in 15 minutes. She lives like half an hour away from me. I have no clue what to think of it. Back in the early 2000s, my parents and I lived in a neighborhood that was heavily involved in witchcraft, Satanism, etc. We didn't actually discover this until we had moved away, so it all made sense afterwards. We lived in this house for 5 years. Our house was 2 stories. We had a basement, which was our family room, that also had a separate office room. We detached the door to the room so it would be permanently open, directly facing the couch we would sit on to watch TV together as a family. Adjacent to the office, we had an electric piano right against the wall, so the office entrance would be on our right if we were sitting there. To go upstairs, you'd have to directly pass the office and face the door that goes into our garage. This info will be important later. The first year was fine, but gradually the events became more malicious and sinister, to the point where we couldn't take it anymore. We were likely the only Christian family in our neighborhood, and I believe that others caught on because we didn't celebrate Halloween and we didn't participate in giving out candy to the neighborhood kids. This angered our community, even though we were kind to others and we kept to ourselves for the most part. Our house was egged, and we became a target of seemingly harmless pranks and house vandalism. Then, all of the paranormal events started happening after my black cat disappeared right before Halloween. We were coming home from church one night, and it was close to midnight. We pulled into our neighborhood, and sitting on the sidewalk corner all by himself was a little boy in a green shirt. My parents were slightly unsettled because it was unsafe and unusual for a child to be out this late at night. They considered talking to this boy, but when we drove up to him, he looked up and my parents saw that he had no face. A completely blank slate where his face should be. Needless to say, we booked it home, and my parents didn't tell me at the time, because I was maybe 5 or 6, to spare me from nightmares. But some years later, they told me this and what happened. Then things started happening around the house. My mom and I used to take piano lessons. So one day, while my dad was cooking lunch, my mom was in the basement practicing on the electric piano. I was in my parents' room watching Stanley, a children's cartoon that was really popular back then. While my mom was practicing piano, a child's hand popped out of the office room and mimicked a child's voice, telling my mom to come and play. She thought it was me and told me to cut it out. The voice coerced her again to play, and my mom became irritated that I was distracting her from practicing, so she stomped into the office to find no one there. I'll never forget how pale she was when I heard her scream my name and run upstairs. She asked my dad where I was, and since I heard her, I ran to her, asking what it was that she needed from me. She asked me if I was messing with her, and I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. My dad chimed in too, and said I was in the bedroom the whole time. She concluded that it must have been her imagination, apologized to us, and went back downstairs. Not even 10 minutes later, she runs back upstairs panicking, saying that the child's hand appeared again in the office, talking to her, and she knew it couldn't have been me. She was freaked out the rest of the day for sure. Another instance was when we were watching The Ring in the basement at night. Around the time of the first jump scare of the movie, when they open the closet and see the disfigured girl, my dog starts barking like crazy at the office entrance. He would charge at it and then back away, as if something was trying to force its way closer to us. It became really cold, and I started crying because I felt scared and uncomfortable at my dog's strange behavior. My dad turned on the light in the office, but nothing was there. My dog was going nuts, chasing something we couldn't see, so we decided to call it a night and go upstairs to bed. My dog had a big crate in the garage that he would sleep in, so my dad put him in there before we went to bed. At this point, we called a minister from our church to come and pray for us. He prayed for our protection, but things got so much worse after that. A few nights later, we all woke up to screaming coming from the garage. It sounded like a little girl being brutally murdered, screaming so loud that it pierced my ears. My dog was also barking like crazy, so we knew we had to do something. My mom and I hid behind a dresser, and my dad hesitantly took a long decorative bamboo stick as a weapon to go to the garage and see what was going on. He said that he was shaking going downstairs, and the screaming got louder and more violent, right up until his hand touched the doorknob. As soon as he did, complete silence. It was eerie and too quiet. The only thing making noise was my dog whimpering and barking, so my dad got him as quickly as possible and noped right back upstairs. We started sleeping in the same room after that. Once we settled back down, my mom and I fell asleep first, but my dad was wide awake. He said that he could hear something pressing buttons on the TV remote on his bedside table. He didn't dare look, but shut his eyes and pretended to sleep until he eventually did. Another day, my mom was at work, and my dad was outside mowing the lawn. Being an only child, not interested in AOL dial-up internet yet, I had to find ways to entertain myself. I was spinning in circles until I made myself dizzy. Mid-spin, I saw a man standing in the hallway with the gun pointed right at me. I was so startled, but I was so dizzy, so I fell over, scared to death. I screamed for my dad and ran sloppily to the front door. I didn't want to look back if he was still there. Dad was worried sick for me in my panic state, but what can he do? What could any of us have done? Dad put up the house for sale and sold it to the first buyer. We were out of there so quick it wasn't even funny. These events traumatized me, and I'm extremely hypersensitive to evil spirits and evil energy. Horror movies don't scare me at all, compared to the real fear and panic you feel in those moments. When I was little, my family lived in a 2-room apartment with 2 bathrooms, one in the master bedroom and one in the hallway, a kitchen, and a living room. There was also a balcony that had these long, flexible sliding blinds that hang down vertically from their track. My bedroom was just across from the guest hallway bathroom. My parents' room was at the end of the hallway, and on the other end of the kitchen, which was on the right-hand side facing towards the master bedroom. On the left side, there was a small space for a table, and behind the table was the sliding balcony door. The living room occupied the rest of the space. I spent the first 3 years of my life in that apartment, and during the time, my parents claimed to have witnessed things moving on their own, things that they would put down on the center of tables rolling or sliding off, or the vertical blinds falling off the track without any kind of influence. The most chilling thing from that time that my parents have both told me was that I had an imaginary friend who I named Elmo. Elmo was extremely tall enough that his back would be against the wall, and he was all red. According to my dad, I would often talk to myself. When asked who I was talking to, I would reply, stating that I was talking to my imaginary friend. When things were put in the wrong places, I'd say that Elmo did it. If things fell off the table, Elmo did it. If the TV was left on at night, Elmo did it. Despite these creepy occurrences, nobody really batted an eye until the same year we left that apartment. I remember having very vivid nightmares and sleep paralysis episodes at a very young age. And I had a distinct fear of the bathroom across the hall from my room. My little brother would also refuse to use that bathroom alone, even in the daytime. Our guess is he saw something in there much like I had in my own room at the same age. By the end of that year, my parents had decided it was best for us to move. My father even admitted to having the home blessed before we moved out, which is saying a lot, since he normally was not superstitious or a paranormal believer. He holds the same belief I do, where we don't believe in the paranormal unless it shows itself to us. The fact that my father felt that he needed to have the apartment blessed before we moved out really makes me wonder, was there influence to that decision? But I digress. Now that the major context is out of the way, here's the part that came up recently. I was babysitting my youngest brother at my grandma's house. My dad is a single parent now, and he often needs breaks from watching my youngest brother to take important meeting calls. So either myself or my grandma will take over that role. At the time, he was either 4 or 5. He's on the autism spectrum, and as a result, especially back then, he had a hard time communicating in full sentences. He still was, and is, able to get his points across with somewhat fuller sentences, but at this time, he would only say 1 or 2 words at most. This particular day, I was entirely home alone watching him until my grandma got back to take over. Normally, one of my aunts would be there, but this particular day, it was just my brother and I. At some point, he got very upset and began trying to block off the hallway that my grandma's bathroom was in. Her hallway closet and pantry door both open outward, and you can cover the hallway with the doors. At first, I tried to get him away from the doors and move him to the living room, which was closer to the front door so I could investigate. I got my knife from my bag and had him wait in the living room as I went to see what would have scared him. I checked every inch of the bathroom, all 3 bedrooms in that hallway, the closets, the bathroom and the master bedroom, everything. I couldn't figure out what spooked him. Despite not finding anything remotely threatening as I searched, I just felt really uneasy. That could, of course, be written off as paranoia due to the situation of me, a teenaged girl, Alone in a house with a boy who's getting scared about something in a dim hallway with 4 rooms and 2 closets. But the feeling was eerie, nonetheless. When my grandma got home, I of course asked if my brother had done this before when she was watching him, and to my surprise, she said yes. She told me that he's been getting scared and saying there was a monster in his room at night. She also brought up how he was the same age as my other brother and I were when we saw, who I suspect was the imaginary friend, Elmo, and reminded me that my grandpa, who was a religious leader of sorts in her church, was the one who blessed the apartment before we moved. Later on, I brought up this experience to my dad, who also agreed the situation was similar to what happened when we lived in the apartment all those years ago. He also told me that my mom had seen a tall figure as well throughout her life and my childhood. However, we wrote that off since she has been on substances for the majority of the time I've been alive. Either way, I find the whole situation just incredibly unnerving, regardless if it's some kind of spirit or just some kind of hallucination my whole family seems to be prone to seeing. I have an 18-month-old baby girl, and part of our routine every Monday, we walk from our flat to a park and back, via a different route through another park, because she likes to look at the cherry blossoms. We've done this every single Monday for around 13 months now. I've never changed the route, and it's roughly the same time every week. We took off, got to the first park, and all was okay. But for some strange reason, I felt I was in a panic. My heart rate was high. I felt a bit anxious, and I didn't really want to stay, but my daughter was having a good time. Eventually, I worked out that there was no one else in the park, just us, and it's usually quite full, so I thought that must be it. We started our walk home, where we changed the route to walk through the second park, which has the cherry blossoms. I know this route like the back of my hand. Crossed at a set of lights, and then first right and up the hill to the park. Not a complicated route. I was walking with my head down, and suddenly realized I have no idea where I am. I've lived in the city for 16 years. It felt completely off. No cars, no leaves, no wind. It was deadly silent. I went to stop and walk back the way I came, presuming somehow I've managed to screw up the route. Suddenly, a car drives past with a woman in a brown jacket and hat and a pair of black sunglasses. I think we'll just keep going, end up at the park somehow. Then another red car, same woman with the same jacket, hat, and glasses, but the car is slightly different. I think that's a bit bizarre. And then it happens again. Red car, woman in a jacket with a hat and glasses. I pick up the pace and go down a different street, but something felt really bad about going that way, so I kept going straight, and after about 20 minutes of walking, I get to the end, and I'm on the road that takes me to the park I was aiming at. But suddenly, all noises, leaves, and cars are back. I get to the park and I check my phone, and it's 2 p.m. I left the first park at 10:45 a.m. It takes 25 minutes to get from that park to the second one. I couldn't have been walking more than 20 minutes down that street. The following day, I woke up early for work, and I couldn't stop thinking about the road, so I left earlier in my car, and I couldn't find it anywhere. I tried 2 different ways, where I entered and where I exited, and the routes I ended up on were not that road I walked down. This could be taken as a really wild coincidence, but in 2007, I lost my Sony CyberShot digital camera. I was with my friend taking pictures, and I left it on the steps of a school. I went back later, and it wasn't there. I was so sad. The memory card was huge and had years' worth of photos on it. Fast forward to around 4 to 6 months after I lost my camera. Me and my best friend were walking along a completely different street, and I happened to see a memory card on the floor. I grab it because why not? It was mine. The one from the stolen camera. It seems very obvious, right? Someone found it and took out the memory card and tossed it. Cool. I live in Brooklyn, New York. My neighborhood is home to I think like 129,000 people. How on earth did I find this memory card months later, 20 blocks from where it was lost? And all of the places I looked that day, my eyes just looked down and saw the memory card. I've been having this nightmare for a while. It doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, it's usually the same thing every time. I'm a little kid, and I'm in my bedroom, lying down in bed. The curtains are drawn, and I can see a bright light shining through them, sometimes red and blue ones too. Then, when I sit up, I can see shadows of people running back and forth, trying to look through my window. I hide, but I can hear people talking. When I run out of my room, I can see people coming in on the patio and into the house, and I'm always too scared to look at them. I run down the hallway to the bathroom and hide, and then I wake up. I can't explain it. It's hard for me to push myself to wake up so I can really get out of it. It always feels so vivid, and it feels so real. I've only had one incidence of lost time that I can remember, around the age I remember when the nightmares started. I went to sleep in my bedroom and woke up in my mom's bedroom with no explanation. I don't remember getting up and walking to her room at all. People suggested I ask my mom what happened on the night I remember losing time, so I did. I thought she would tell me I've been reading too many scary stories, or that she didn't remember. But she gave me some decent information. It happened when I was 6. She remembers waking up and seeing me next to the side of her bed. She said I was talking, saying, "Nobody listened to me." Then I got into bed, and I asked her to leave the lamp and TV on before I went to sleep. Then she said that soon after is when I started to have explicit nightmares about aliens and monsters kidnapping me through my bedroom window, and when I started getting really deep into TV shows about the paranormal. She doesn't remember the lights, but she also doesn't remember me opening her door and walking in. From then on, for a little while, I would wake up in the middle of the night and go to her bedroom and ask to sleep with her because I was scared. I haven't been able to sleep with the lights off since then. Again, I don't remember any of this. My mom also said that shortly before the incident of lost time, I started seeing a shadow figure in the house. I called him Steven, and for some time I was really adamant that it was spelled with a PH and not a V. My mom thought it was just an imaginary friend. Then she saw the shadow man standing over me while I was sleeping, who disappeared into thin air when she turned the lights on. 6 years ago, my mom found out that there was a family in the neighborhood before they moved in, whose sons were drafted for the Vietnam War. Only one came home, Steven. In 1978, he took his own life, on the same day I would be born 20 years later. I don't know if the two things are related, but that was the timeline of events my mom helped me piece together. It still doesn't explain what happens completely, but at least someone remembers something. My mom said she would try to see if she could remember more, and tell me if she did. This happened this summer at a barbecue I had with some of the neighbors on our street. I had made a comment to my neighbor about how I should make a green salad, but the heat wouldn't permit it. This is important for later. The afternoon carried on as normal. The sun started to set, and I suggested we get a game of cornhole going. I have a board that I painted myself that glows in the dark with LED lights around the board, and I have bags that also glow, 4 pink and 4 green. We paired up and separated the bags, 4 green and 4 pink. After 3 rounds, the other team is up by 3, and it's now my turn. I throw my first bag, a pink one, and boom, it sinks perfectly into the hole. You could see the pink illuminate through the hole, clear as day. The other team lets out the typical, "Ugh." My partner and I cheer our neighbors on who were just watching. We continue on taking turns throwing our bags. As the other side starts to collect the bags, I see them look around for my pink bag that I made directly in, and they can't find it anywhere. There are no kids or pets to blame, and I thought that maybe the other person jokingly hid the bag. They both tell me they haven't touched it and look equally as confused. Now all of us spend the next 20 minutes searching in this tiny backyard, dumping the trash can and looking in the neighbor's yard for the bag, but to no avail. The bag was never found. So we called the game and figured that we would find it later. We all kind of exchanged, "That's weird," faces with each other. If you've ever played cornhole, you know that when the bag sinks into the hole, there really isn't any other place that it could be. But whatever. I brushed it off and started tidying up, clearing plates and emptying cups, when I notice the table with all of the food on it. And right in the center is a freaking salad. Did someone come in late and bring the salad? I'm just standing there when I notice that it isn't just a salad, but it's in one of my salad bowls. I am floored. I don't want to sound crazy, so I casually ask each neighbor if it was them that brought the salad, but they all said no. The neighbor I had made the comment to about making a salad, but knowing it wouldn't be good in this weather, remembered me saying that, and seeing that bowl, but never paid attention to what was in it. As the night ended, and I'm cleaning up the rest of the mess, I decide again to look for the bag, and I never find it. My friend is inside washing the dishes, and asked me who the salad bowl belongs to. I had figured maybe I did make the salad and forgot, so the bowl was mine. Except when I went to put it away, my exact same bowl was already in the cabinet. I just stood there, stunned. How could that be? They even had the same tiny piece of the price sticker on the bottom of the bowl that no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't get off, and that clear sticky part remained. I'm a logical thinker. I truly believe everything can be explained away somehow, so I still tell myself that this has to be the case. Maybe the bag got picked up on accident. Maybe I had 2 identical bowls. Maybe I just forgot. But no one claimed the bowl or found the bag, so it will always leave a little bit of doubt in my mind of what really happened that day. My house is in a pretty small neighborhood with no shops nearby, the closest one being a 20-minute walk across a huge field with tall grass surrounded by trees that people mostly use for dog walking. One night, around 9:30 p.m., I was taking a walk to the shop for some snacks, and something super strange happened that I still can't explain. The field has a gravel path right down the middle, leading from one side to the other. These days, lampposts are installed, but this was a few years ago when crossing the field in the night meant paying lots of attention to stay on the path. So I got to just over halfway through the field, following the path as I did every time. I reached into my pocket for my phone to check the time and accidentally pulled out a 5-pound note with it, which landed on the gravel path at my feet. I distinctly remember reaching down and picking up the 5 pounds, from the gravel and putting it back in my pocket. I continued walking and switched my phone screen on for literally 2 seconds to see the time. And as soon as I switched it back off, I was in the middle of a tall grass, a good 40 to 50 feet away from the path. Somehow, in those 2 seconds I had checked my phone, I had gone from walking on the gravel path to walking in grass that came up to my waist. Although it doesn't sound particularly scary, the feeling of utter confusion as to how it happened still spooks me to this day, remembering what it felt like to stand in the tall grass in that dark field. I moved away for a couple of years, so I didn't venture that way again. And now I've moved back home, and there's a new shop that doesn't require dealing with teleportation to get a can of root beer. My house had a strange energy growing up, always did. But then when I turned 10, my mom made the worst decision in her life. She had bought me a Ouija board because I saw one online and I was begging for it. So I got one. For my 10th birthday party, I held it at my friend's house, her little trailer. There was about 6 of us, all about 10 to 11 years old. We played the Ouija board in her kitchen, which was connected to her back living room. Her back living room had extremely scary vibes to it, and I never slept back there because of it. So we just started asking questions after we lit a bunch of candles. We connected to a woman named Abby. She spelled out words that were violent and horrible. I'll just say that. After spelling out that she died because of someone else doing something bad to her, if you know what I mean, the candles went out. We were in the complete dark. Nobody blew out the candles, and then we all screamed and everyone started crying. So a while goes by, and me and my friend Alex continue playing with this board to talk to Abby. She told us that she was a young girl who passed away in a violent way, and that she was angry and wanted to harm us too. The next day, I got a message from my friend saying whatever I did to her at the sleepover wasn't funny, and now she hates me. Dramatic 10-year-olds. I had no idea what she was talking about. She sent a photo of a large scratch on her back. I continued receiving things like this from my friends. Then it happened to me. 3 large red marks on my back, like claws. A while goes by, and honestly, I'm struggling to remember what happened. I recall Abby saying she wanted a body, so I brought her a doll. The doll had light brown curly hair, a red bow, and an older Victorian red velvet dress, and green-brown eyes. Her skin was porcelain and very fragile. The doll would move around on its own, and I always became very uncomfortable around it. The older I got, the less activity happened. I thought that she had left me entirely for a while, until I saw a psychic, and she told me I had an extremely dark energy attached to me. She told me it wasn't a little girl, as Abby came off as a younger girl or woman usually. She said it was most likely a demonic energy. I used sage and everything to try to get rid of it. For a while, this worked. Then when I was 14, I bought dowsing rods, and I was messing around with them with my friends at school, boarding school, so I wasn't home. My friend was talking to her male cousin who had passed away, and all of a sudden, my other friend screams. She turns around and said something that I will never forget. "She hurt me!" We looked at her back, and there was blood everywhere. After that, we closed the rod session, and I went into a full-blown panic attack and explained everything about Abby. These girls never even knew about her, and the one girl who got scratched said that she had been dreaming about the doll I talked about. When I went home, I got rid of the doll and made a vow to never bring her up again, except for this post. I will never be able to explain why the girls and I both got scratched. Most of the activity in my house is now gone, but something is just off every time I hear her name, or anyone who remotely reminds me of the doll. One of the most evil things I have ever encountered was a little girl named Abby, who was not a little girl. This happened over 20 years ago, so the details of which station have been lost to memory. I used to get the train to York, near where I grew up, from Exeter, where I went to university. Sometimes the most direct route was not possible due to the train line being washed away by floods, and I would go via London. On one occasion, even my normal route through London on the tube was disrupted, and I had to take different lines between Paddington, or Waterloo on a really bad day, and King's Cross. This was a very wet and miserable day. At this particular station, I had to change tube lines, and not being familiar with the area, I couldn't work out how to get from where I was on one platform level to the one I wanted, so I decided to exit the station completely, then re-enter, hoping to pick up the signs for where I wanted to go. On exiting the station, I found myself on an empty street. In warm weather, the sky a yellowish-orange color, similar to how I've seen North African cities appear on TV. One or two old cars on the street, but no other person. I remember being the only person climbing the stairs to leave the station, which had been busy. I remember thinking it was a bit odd. I re-entered the station as I intended, found the platform I wanted, got to King's Cross, and on my northbound train to York, proceeded out of the station and into the dank, miserable weather that I'd had all morning. I've often thought about that day, and every so often look at a tube map on Google Maps to try to remember which station that this happened at, but I can't remember or work it out. About 13 years ago, my sister and I were living in different states. She was in Louisiana, and I was in Virginia. I knew if I got a call from a 318 area code, it was someone from home, Louisiana. One night, I was in my apartment in Virginia watching SpongeBob or something, and I get a phone call from a 318 number that I didn't recognize, but I answered it anyway. Before I get into the phone call, I should say that a lot of people in my hometown call their siblings sister or brother, rather than their name. So I picked up the phone, and I heard my sister's voice. She kept saying, "Sister, sister, sister," over and over. She wouldn't answer any of my questions. She just kept saying sister, and hung up. I called the number back. A man answered. I asked him about my sister and why she had just called me from this number. The man on the other end assured me that he had never heard of my sister. We have extremely unique names that you'll not hear anywhere else, and that his phone never dialed my number. So I started to get super angry. I called him a liar and told him I was going to call the police in Shreveport. He hung up after he told me that he didn't know us. Before I called the police in Shreveport, I decided to call my sister's actual phone, and she answered. She said she didn't call me, and she didn't know the number that she allegedly called from. I remember it like it was yesterday, and it still bothers the hell out of me. My sister called me, sounding like she was in trouble, and I'm still extremely confused. When I was 25 years old, I was driving home from work one night. I lived in Los Angeles at the time. I was driving on Sunset Boulevard heading west towards my apartment in Brentwood. For those that are not familiar with the area, there's an expanse of sunset near UCLA that is very curvy. It's 2 lanes on either side with no shoulder. It was 8:30 on a Saturday night, so there was some traffic. I was driving along, and all of a sudden, about 50 feet in front of me, I saw a car, but I was looking at the passenger door. A car had spun out of control and was perpendicular in my lane. I didn't have time to stop. I looked to my right, and there was a car next to me, so I had nowhere to go. I instinctively turned my car all the way to the right anyway. Once I had cleared the first car, I spun it all the way to the left, still trying to avoid the second car. While all of this was happening, I remembered a time with my mom at Disney World when I was 3. This is not a memory I've ever had. I vaguely remember parts of that trip, but this memory was not one of them. I realized then that my life was flashing before me, and I was going to die. I've never been so sure of anything. Every part of me knew I was going to die. I started screaming. To this day, I don't even know if I vocalized anything or if it was all in my head. I yelled, "No! No, this isn't fair. I'm not done yet." All the while swerving all over Sunset Boulevard. I suddenly stopped my car, and I was now perpendicular into the opposing lane of traffic. I looked around, and there was not a single car anywhere. It was like everything had been wiped clean. I put my car in reverse and proceeded home. I did not see a single car the rest of the way. I was only 5 minutes away from home at that point, but Sunset Boulevard on a Saturday night was completely empty. I got to my apartment and parked on the street. I didn't see one person. While walking to my apartment, I came to the conclusion that I had died, and because I said no, I was stuck in some limbo. I had never wanted my roommate to be home so badly. Unfortunately, she wasn't. I called one of my best friends and said, "I need to ask you some questions. Please just answer me and I'll explain after." I asked her my name, my age, what city we lived in, and the date. Obviously, she was very alarmed. I explained that I thought I was dead, and I wasn't sure I was really on the phone with her. She tried to convince me that I was alive, and that everything was okay. There was no way mathematically to escape it. There was nowhere for the car on the right to go. This moment has haunted me my whole life. There have been times that I've questioned my existence. I've wondered if my life since has been a very detailed death trip, and I'm actually lying on Sunset Boulevard, bleeding out. This happened to me in December 1969. I'm a retired registered nurse. I have experienced or witnessed many things that are beyond understanding, but I'm also a critical thinker, and my story changed my thoughts on our limited view of reality forever. I was with my high school boyfriend on a typical Friday night in Jeffersonville, Indiana. After socializing with friends at the local hangouts, we would ride out on the rural back roads that were located between downtown and my home in a subdivision. There were dairy farms and cornfields on either side of the road for about 6 miles. The few homes along this stretch sat on the back of the properties, and there were a couple of equipment paths that led to a smaller open field that were our teenager parking spots. Past that, the 2-lane narrow road was heavily wooded with no homes or cleared property for 10 miles. This particular road had many curves and hills, which is typical for southern Indiana. Sparse population and teenage driving led to many accidents. There were no cell phones in those days, and standard operating procedures if one saw an accident was to stop, help, and pray for another motorist to appear to flag down to send to the nearest house to call the police and ambulance, or transport the victims to the hospital yourself. It was a very cold December night, and snow flurries began. We left our parking area immediately as my curfew wasn't to be missed. The remainder of our drive to my home was through the wooded area, and on straightaways we saw taillights quite a bit ahead. As we were approaching the second sharp curve, we saw headlights shining from the ground level and at an angle towards us. We immediately slowed and pulled as far off-road as possible. The grille was damaged, and the passenger side had struck trees. The headlights in the otherwise pitch-black night were blinding. A fully restored, beautiful 1956 Chevy had apparently tried to take the curve too fast and had lost control. The car was off the road on its roof. My boyfriend Greg grabbed his flashlight, got another for me with a first aid kit from the trunk, and we ran to assist anyone that might be injured. The headlights had kept us from seeing how many passengers the car held. I clearly remembered my heart pounding from the adrenaline and my mind fearing injuries as nobody was shouting back to our calling out, and nobody was attempting to get out of the car. I could smell the strong odor of gasoline and burned rubber. The engine was running and making a knocking sound. Greg got down on his knees and opened the driver's side door, and I opened the back. The car was empty. He reached up and turned the ignition. The engine was now off, and the woods were silent. Nothing was making sense. Our headlights and flashlights were giving us light, and we started searching for a possible injured person. The windows were rolled up and starting to fog. Greg had already searched the interior. At this point, our assumption was that the driver must have gotten out, and we just hadn't seen him or her. We didn't understand why they hadn't answered us as we ran to help, or why the car had been left running. We continued to search for a person around the wreck. We tried to go into the woods, but the underbrush and steep embankment was impossible to climb. At this point, we decided whoever was driving must have just walked away. We got back into Greg's car and drove slowly 3 miles back, then turned around and drove slowly the next 6, fully expecting to see somebody needing a ride home or to a telephone. We were relieved that the driver must not be hurt, but couldn't imagine why they didn't see us and how they had left on foot without us seeing them. No other vehicles had come down the road. At this point, the remainder of the road we drove was covered with snow, and we saw no tracks. There were no houses. We went to my house where my parents were waiting as I was really late. Greg told my father what had happened, and then described the car and how beautifully restored it was in case he knew to whom it belonged. The whole incident just left us baffled. By the next day, we decided that maybe there was a house in the woods or a side road that we missed. We both were just really unsettled by it. We didn't know why we were worried about what now appeared to be a non-event. The next day, we went back to the scene of the accident. Both of us felt that we would find a house close by that had gone unnoticed or a side road. Something. We didn't understand why we were still dwelling on it, but little did we know that quite opposite was what we found. The car was still there, but it had been moved into a clearing of trees. There it was, still on its roof, the damaged grille and front fender damage, the accident on Friday night. Here we stood on Sunday afternoon at the car. The paint was faded. The body was completely rusted through over majority of it. The tires were completely rotted and rims were rusted. The interior was dry rotted and covered with mold. The windows were gone, and the windshield was broken with a basketball-sized hole full of vines growing in and out of the car. The embankment we had tried to search was now a clearing, and setting further back into the woods was a small abandoned 2-room shack. We later did a property search, but it only led us to owners that bought acreage with the shack and car on it. All we were left with was a lifetime of questions surrounding a cold December night. It's been years now, but that night still haunts me.